The house on Spooner Street does not speak in voices that can be heard. It does not shout, nor does it sing. Instead, it whispers in creaks, in the soft hum of the refrigerator, in the slow groan of its wooden beams as night settles in. To anyone who passes by, it is just another home in Quahog, painted in muted tones, standing steady against the wind. But to those who live within its walls, it is the keeper of 1,000 memories. And to those willing to listen closely, it tells its story, slowly, carefully, like a lullaby carried through time. I remember the first day they arrived, the Griffins, dragging in boxes that were half filled and half forgotten. Peter stumbled in first, his voice booming, his laughter bouncing off the walls like a pebble skimming a pond. Lois followed behind, her hands steady, her eyes scanning each room as if already trying to tame the chaos she knew would follow. The children were smaller then, their footsteps lighter, their presence softer. Stewie was just an infant, with a glare sharper than the sunlight that peeked through my blinds. Meg lingered, shy, standing in her own silence, and Chris carried the weight of wonder in his wide eyes. Even then, I knew they were not like the others who had come and gone before them. Families had filled these rooms before, voices that painted me with their stories and then faded, leaving only echoes. But the Griffins, were loud, messy, clumsy, and yet so very alive. Every corner of me seemed to stir awake when they entered. Every stair creaked louder, every door swung freer, as if even my structure knew it had met the ones who would make me truly remember. The living room was the first to feel their presence. The furniture shuffled in clumsy arrangements until it finally settled into the formation that has remained for years. The television, a glowing box of endless noise, became the heartbeat of the space. I have watched them gather there in every state, laughing, fighting, falling asleep with bowls of chips still in their laps. I've felt the vibration of Peter's laughter shake through the floorboards, and I've held the weight of Lois's sighs as she sank into the couch after a long day. Even when silence fell, the living room was never truly still. The cushions absorbed their confessions, the carpet held the imprints of restless pacing, and the walls themselves became canvases for echoes that lingered long after the family had gone to bed. That room was their stage, their gathering point, the heart of their chaos. And I, always watching, always listening, carried it all within me. But before the living room, before the clutter of television static and the footsteps of restless children, there was simply me. The house. My bones of wood and nail, my skin of paint, my eyes of windows. I have stood through storms and summers, through winters that cracked my foundation, and springs that washed me with new light. Families came before the Griffins, some brief and some long-lasting, but none left the kind of marks they would. There had been laughter, yes, and sorrow, and nights of quiet prayers whispered in bedrooms, but there was something different when Peter Griffin dragged his heavy footsteps across my porch for the very first time. He was not a man of order or grace, but he carried with him a kind of reckless joy that filled my rooms faster than any boxes could. His voice echoed so loudly that it seemed to make even the air vibrate. Lois, by contrast, was steady, her presence like a thread holding things together, a calm rhythm against his chaos. The children, small, curious, already carving their places into me, followed in, and suddenly, I was alive in ways I had not been for decades. The first nights were restless. I remember the way Peter clattered in the kitchen, opening and closing cupboards, as if trying to discover which ones might reveal hidden treasure. I remember Lois, her voice low, soothing, reminding him that not everything needed to be loud, Meg's quiet footsteps lingered in the hallways as if she wasn't sure she belonged, and Chris's laughter filled his room as he discovered small joys in the simplest things. Stewie, though barely able to walk, already seemed to have plans whispered into the dark corners of his crib. Each sound, each step, each sigh became part of me. I absorbed them like a diary absorbs ink, line after line, page after page. And so the living room became their theater, the kitchen their battlefield, the upstairs hallway their secret passage. I learned quickly that my role was not simply to stand, but to remember, to hold each of them in my walls, to keep their secrets in my attic, to cradle their fears in the basement. They would never know how much of themselves they left within me. They would never hear how, at night, when the house groaned under the weight of memory, it was not age, but the sound of recollection. The Griffins were not the first family to live here, but they were the first to make me feel like I was alive. Their noise was my heartbeat. Their quarrels were my echoes. Their laughter was my breath. And from the very first day, I knew. These were the voices I would carry with me forever. Now, years later, as the nights grow quiet and the neighborhood sleeps, I still play those memories back. Like an old projector casting shadows across bare walls, I replay the early days, the uncertain steps, the clumsy beginnings. I remember Peter setting down his first beer in the living room, the cold condensation sinking into the wood of the table. I remember Lois carefully arranging the curtains as if by controlling the sunlight, she could control the chaos of the household. I remember Meg sitting on the porch for hours, staring at the street, dreaming of somewhere else. Chris drew shapes on the walls with sticky fingers, and Stewie plotted his silent schemes. Each of them claimed a piece of me, even without knowing it. Each of them left their mark. And as the wind moves through the trees outside, brushing against the windows, I sigh with the sound of floorboards settling. I am not just their house. I am their witness. I am their memory. And I will always remember the day the Griffins made me theirs. As the hazy dreamscape of Quahog's forgotten stories continues to unfold, we move deeper into the tangled lives of those who have shaped Peter Griffin's strange, meandering existence. For in every odd encounter and every seemingly trivial detail, there lies a thread that connects him to something larger, something lingering in the shadows of both his family and the world that surrounds him. Peter's story has never been simple. It has always been fractured, echoing between comedy and darkness, between light-hearted mistakes and eerie undertones that suggest more than they reveal. The world of Family Guy often masks itself behind slapstick, absurd humor, and randomness, yet beneath the laughter there is an undertow of eerie familiarity, a sensation that these lives and their struggles reflect something timeless. We left Peter drifting in that liminal space between memory and imagination, where Quahog is at once a town of ridiculous happenings and a stage for deep, almost dreamlike revelations. The story begins to weave together not just Peter's past, but the strange forces and relationships that have guided him unknowingly toward both chaos and destiny. At the heart of Peter's narrative lies the question of why he constantly finds himself tangled in bizarre situations that seem to spiral far beyond the limits of ordinary suburban life. Is Peter truly cursed, or is he the unwitting center of gravity in a universe that thrives on absurdity? Think of the countless times he has stumbled into dangerous territory, encounters with criminal organizations, inexplicable run-ins with the supernatural, or brushes with history itself. To Peter, these moments may feel like isolated gags or strokes of bad luck, yet when stitched together, they form a strange pattern. A pattern that suggests Peter is something more than a bumbling everyman. He is the unwitting magnet of Quahog's deepest, strangest lore. We see glimpses of this in how the world bends around him. His friendships are not ordinary friendships. They are alliances with men like Quagmire and Joe, each with their own haunting backstory, each drawn into Peter's orbit. His family, too, exists in a balance of dysfunction and resilience, bound by his clumsy leadership, yet constantly tested by forces far outside their control. Even the Grim Reaper himself has stood by Peter's side, not always as an adversary, but as a peculiar presence that watches, waits, and sometimes even aids him. Why should death itself take such an interest in Peter Griffin, unless his life holds some weight beyond the obvious? As Peter lies in bed at night, snoring beneath the dim glow of a Quahog streetlight outside, his dreams unravel with images that blur reality with hidden truths. Sometimes, in those half-asleep visions, he wanders through the town, not as a clumsy man, but as if he were a thread holding the tapestry of Quahog together. His encounters, those with the chicken in their endless brawls, with mysterious figures that come and go, with surreal detours into universes beyond his own, begin to resemble chapters of a fate that only he is too oblivious to notice. The comedy hides it well, yet the lore seeps through. And so this episode begins by unraveling not just Peter's story, but the stories that orbit him, the legends that brush against his world like whispers in the dark. In Quahog, no character is entirely ordinary, and every side figure may hold a secret that ties back into the strange gravitational pull of the Griffin family. Chapter by chapter, the truth unfolds that perhaps Peter's life, however absurd, is both the cause and the effect of Quahog's eternal strangeness. The first tale we follow brings us back to a familiar figure who has walked through Peter's journey before, Death himself. The Grim Reaper, cloaked in black, has always been portrayed with comedic levity in Family Guy, stumbling, cracking jokes, and sometimes failing in his duties. Yet his repeated appearances near Peter hint at something more. Why does Death seem to appear around Peter more often than anyone else in Quahog? Why does their relationship sometimes feel oddly personal, as though Death is both amused by and invested in Peter's existence? Imagine the unsettling possibility that Peter is not just another soul on Death's list, but a hinge upon which the very balance of Quahog's reality rests. In this dreamlike retelling, Death is not merely a background gag, but a recurring shadow following Peter, testing him, ensuring that his story continues long past the point where it should have ended. Could it be that Death finds entertainment in Peter, or perhaps that Death fears what would happen if Peter's life was ever truly cut short? This relationship is not merely chance, it is lore hidden beneath the laughter. We are also reminded of Peter's strange brushes with history and power, moments that place him far beyond the reach of an ordinary suburban father. He has, through sheer randomness, stood at the center of revolutions, altered the course of history, and befriended, or angered, figures far larger than life. From strange conspiracies to time travel with Stewie, Peter's presence echoes again and again in places it should not. Each event, while seemingly absurd, builds a hidden chronology, a secret history where Peter Griffin is not just a fool, but a key piece of something larger than himself. As we unravel this, the shadows of Quahog grow deeper. The town itself begins to feel less like a comedic backdrop and more like a stage where unseen forces test their characters like pawns on a board. And Peter, in his obliviousness, moves across this board without ever realizing the role he plays. He may be laughed at, dismissed as clumsy and foolish, but perhaps it is precisely his lack of awareness that makes him immune to the weight of the strange fate that binds him. Here, in this dreamy retelling, Peter becomes less of a caricature and more of a paradox, a man who is both insignificant and crucial, both the joke and the centerpiece of a cosmic stage. His flaws, his mistakes, his endless chaos, these are not accidents, but rather the necessary cracks that allow the hidden lore of Quahog to seep through. His story begins to resemble not just a sitcom, but a myth told beneath the surface of comedy. As this chapter continues, the dream narrows to a single image: Peter asleep. The world outside his window drenched in the haze of a streetlight and the hum of distant thunder. Standing in the corner of the room, unseen yet ever present, is death. He does not move, does not speak, but simply waits, his scythe glinting faintly in the shadows. It is not Peter's time, not yet. But the presence itself is a reminder that Peter's life is not ordinary, that it is marked, watched, and preserved for reasons no one fully understands. And as the scene lingers in silence, we drift back into the stories that surround Peter, the voices of Quahog whispering their fragments of truth, each one building upon the other, each one waiting to reveal the full, haunting, and surreal lore that lies beneath the laughter. And so when we peel back the comedic timing and outrageous dialogue, what remains is the hum of silence that lingers behind each episode. A silence where Stewie sits with his inventions, where Brian sips from his glass with thoughts too heavy for the living room chatter, and where Meg, quietly ignored, holds unspoken stories no one listens to. This silence is more revealing than the punchline, more telling than the gag. It is in this space that the Griffin family becomes more than a sitcom family. They become symbols, shadows, and reflections of things we often ignore in ourselves. When we drift deeper into the Griffin household, the first voice that echoes in the night isn't Peter's boisterous laugh or Lois's sigh of exasperation. It is the muffled clink of ice in Brian's glass. He is the soul of the show in ways that are easy to miss, the conscience wrapped in sarcasm, the philosopher disguised as a family pet. But within his musings lies the weight of loneliness, of unfulfilled potential, and of yearning for connection in a world that often drowns him out with noise. Brian's role is often overlooked because his wit makes it easy to assume he is in control, a step above the chaos. Yet when the lights dim, when the scenes cut away, he becomes a figure haunted by his own contradictions. He is intelligent, but trapped in mundanity. He is eloquent, but his words rarely bring him the understanding he craves. And most of all, he is surrounded by a family that cares for him in ways both shallow and profound, though he struggles to accept it. Think about the glass of scotch in his paw. It isn't just a gag. It's a ritual. Each pour reflects his longing for sophistication, an attempt to belong to a class of people he admires, but never fully joins. He writes novels, but the pages remain unfinished. He philosophizes, but the wisdom often falls flat in the ears of those who can't meet him at his level. His brilliance is paired with failure, making him one of the most human characters despite not being human at all. And in this strange duality lies Brian's lore. He is the character who constantly seeks to redefine himself. Sometimes he is the liberal intellectual, sometimes the bitter cynic, sometimes the hopeless romantic, and sometimes the self-sabotaging addict. These roles change like the seasons, yet the one thing that never fades is his desire to be more. And isn't that the deepest, most haunting theme of all? the desire to be more than we are, to find meaning in the spaces where meaning slips through our fingers. But Brian isn't alone in this quiet search. Stewie, for all his dramatics, is walking the same shadowed road. His inventions are not simply about destruction, nor are his schemes truly about control. They are attempts at breaking free from childhood, from weakness, from being dismissed as just a baby. His intelligence isolates him, just as Brian's intellect builds a wall around him. In a way, the two characters are mirrors of each other, one bound by the leash of adulthood and unfulfilled ambition, the other bound by the crib rails of childhood and unrealized potential. Their connection forms one of the most fascinating undercurrents in Family Guy, not just because they pair well for comedic misadventures, but because they embody the same existential questions at different stages of life. Brian asks, "What do you do when life hasn't turned out the way you plan?" Stewie asks, "How do you escape before it does?" Together, they create a dialogue that sits beneath the chaos of cutaway gags and outrageous plots. It is a dialogue about the inevitability of time, the futility of control, and the haunting presence of failure. And yet the darkness of this connection isn't bleak. It is strangely comforting, because even as they sit in their struggles, Brian and Stewie find companionship in one another. Their conversations are often laced with sarcasm and arrogance, but underneath, there is tenderness. There are moments where Stewie's sharpness softens in Brian's presence, and moments where Brian's bitterness is eased by Stewie's unlikely loyalty. Their friendship, unusual as it may seem, becomes a lifeline for them both, a place where the silence is filled with understanding. But if Stewie and Brian form the philosophical core of the show, the true shadow of tragedy hovers over Meg. She is the invisible thread, the character whose pain is so often played for laughs that it becomes easy to forget just how real her suffering feels. Her constant rejection by family, her ridicule by peers, her role as the perpetual outcast. These are not just comedic devices. They are echoes of real loneliness, the kind many viewers quietly recognize. Meg's story is not just about neglect. It is about the human need to be seen, to have someone listen, to have someone acknowledge that you exist beyond the role of the punching bag. And while the family rarely gives her this recognition, her presence reminds us of something larger, that in every family, there are voices that go unheard, people who remain in the shadows despite their quiet resilience. There is something almost poetic about the way the show handles her. She doesn't get the triumphs, the redemption arcs, or the spotlight. Instead, she embodies the hidden pain of being overlooked, the strange numbness that comes when cruelty becomes routine. And yet, despite it all, she persists. She remains in the background, carrying the weight of her silence, a silence that speaks louder than any gag could. And when we view these three characters together, Brian, Stewie, and Meg, we begin to see the architecture of Family Guy's hidden lore. This isn't just a show about gags and cutaways. It's a tapestry of longing. Brian longs for significance. Stewie longs for freedom. Meg longs for recognition. These are not comedic desires. They are universal ones. And it is in this universal ache that the show transcends comedy, reaching into something deeper, something dreamlike. The laughter then becomes a mask. Behind Peter's absurd antics, Lois's exasperated sighs, and Chris's naive confusion lies a house that hums with shadows. A house where the dog is a philosopher, the baby is an inventor yearning to escape, and the daughter carries pain that no one notices. It is this contrast, the comedy above and the tragedy below, that gives Family Guy its strange, enduring pull. And in the quiet of night, when the cutaway gags fade and the laughter has settled, you can almost hear it. The soft creak of the Griffin house as if it were breathing, holding secrets within its walls. Each room has its own echo, each corner a forgotten story. And within that silence, the characters linger, their shadows stretching across the floors of Quahog, whispering the truths that the show only hints at. The memory of Quahog's beginnings continues to hang in the air, and as if the town itself is eager to peel back more of its layered history, the narrative slides further into a deeper current. If the Griffins are the pulse of Quahog, then the town's forgotten foundations are its bones, hidden beneath the laughter and absurdity that fills each episode. And it is here, in the unseen layers, that the story unfolds even further, showing us the strange way this town has always existed, on the edge of normality, balancing between the mundane and the bizarre, the comforting and the unsettling. We start to drift backward into the oddities that once seemed small, moments that were brushed off as background details, yet they weave together into a tapestry that feels eerily deliberate. Long before Peter Griffin stumbled into his endless misadventures, the geography of Quahog was already playing tricks. The harbor that sometimes appears vast, stretching endlessly into the horizon, at other times shrinks into a small cove tucked tightly against the town's edge. Streets twist upon themselves, as if daring you to question their layout. But the residents never do. They simply walk them as if they've always been there. And perhaps that's the strange magic of Quahog. What shifts, what changes, what feels off-kilter, is always normalized by those who call it home. This distortion is not simply about maps or architecture. It's about the way reality itself bends. Consider how time loops in on itself. Characters caught in situations that feel oddly familiar, as if they've lived through them before, only slightly altered. And maybe in some way they have. Because Quahog's strange heart seems to allow stories to replay, memories to reemerge, almost as if the town itself is testing out different versions of reality to see which one feels right. As this strange current of thought flows, we find ourselves moving deeper into the lore of the town's people, not just the Griffins, but those who fill the background of this animated world. Each one, in their own way, feels like an echo of something larger. Take Mort Goldman, the jittery pharmacist, whose store has withstood fires, invasions, and inexplicable disasters that should have closed its doors years ago. Or Cleveland Brown, who once drifted from the main current of Quahog into his own story before circling back again, as if gravity itself demanded his return. Even Joe Swanson, bound to his chair yet never bound in spirit, represents Quahog's resilience, broken but never diminished, always rolling forward with a stubborn kind of dignity. The town gathers them, holds them, and bends reality around them. In this way, Quahog becomes less of a place and more of a living presence, one that listens, one that adapts, one that thrives on the chaos it houses. And when you look closer, when you linger in its shadows, it becomes harder to tell if the residents are shaping the town, or if the town is quietly shaping them. It is here, in this murky intersection between place and person, that the idea of destiny begins to creep in. Perhaps Peter was always meant to bumble through life in this exact town, where his mistakes would be forgiven and his misadventures endlessly reset. Perhaps Lois was always destined to be the grounding force, tied not just to Peter, but to the very foundation of Quahog's strange endurance. Perhaps Stewie, with his schemes and inventions, is not so much trying to escape the town as he is responding to its influence, trying desperately to bend its rules before they bend him entirely. And this notion that Quahog has always had a hand in its people's lives spreads like a quiet fog through the narrative. We begin to imagine the town whispering, pulling its residents closer, reminding them that while they may dream of escape, Quahog will always be their anchor. Peter may stumble into fantastical adventures across the globe. Stewie may build a machine that breaches time and space. Brian may seek enlightenment in literature and philosophy. But always, always the story returns home. And perhaps that is no accident. To truly understand Quahog, then, is not just to map its streets or list its residents. It is to notice the rhythm in which life flows through it. The cyclical patterns, the endless return, the subtle reminders that everything here is bound to repeat. It is to feel the town's pull, as if some unseen current is always guiding its people back to where they began, back to the house on Spooner Street, back to the laughter and chaos that recenters the world. The dreamlike tone lingers as we imagine Quahog itself as a kind of storyteller. Every gag, every cutaway, every surreal twist is not random, but carefully placed. A kind of cosmic wink from the town itself. The humor that feels absurd is also the heartbeat of something deeper, a reminder that in Quahog, nothing is ever truly out of place, even when it makes no sense at all. It's as though the town is in on the joke, pulling strings in the background, nudging events into motion, ensuring that life never drifts too far from the ridiculous. And yet, as comforting as this cycle may seem, there is also something unsettling about it. If Quahog is alive in this way, if it is the invisible hand guiding its people, then what does that mean for those who live there? Are they free to shape their destinies? Or are they simply actors in the town's endless play, repeating scenes in different variations for an unseen audience? This tension, the space between freedom and fate, is what makes Quahog's lore feel both enchanting and haunting. The narrative sways here, balancing between warmth and unease. The familiar comfort of Peter lounging in front of the TV or Lois cooking dinner is woven tightly with the strange realization that these moments are part of an endless cycle, one that Quahog itself insists must continue. And so, as we drift deeper into the story, the town begins to feel less like a backdrop and more like a force of nature, shaping, bending, laughing, and remembering all at once. Like a dream, Quahog never holds still. Its edges blur, its colors shift, its stories fold back upon themselves. And through it all, the Griffins remain its anchors, the family whose presence both defines the town and is defined by it. In their laughter and chaos, the deeper truth of Quahog hums quietly, waiting for those willing to listen closely enough to hear it. The tale carried forward like a low hum in the silence of the night, drifting across the lingering image of the Griffin family sitting at the table, their faces tense, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. It was the kind of moment where laughter and comfort had no place, where every movement, every glance seemed to carry an echo of something foreboding. The candles on the table, flickering low against the storm outside, cast shadows that stretched unnaturally long across the walls, as though the house itself was alive, pulling itself into their story. Meg, sitting slightly apart from the others, tapped her fingers nervously against the table's wooden surface. Her eyes darted every so often to the window, where the occasional crack of lightning illuminated the yard in short, violent bursts of clarity. She wanted to speak, to to ask if anyone else had felt it. Something intangible yet undeniable, the way the house seemed to breathe, the way the silence pressed against them like a weight. But she didn't. The silence had rules, and in this moment, it was Peter who broke it. Peter's voice, strangely quiet, lacked its usual bumbling enthusiasm. "You know," he said, eyes narrowed, "this house has seen a lot of things. Things I don't think any of us even know about." Lois shot him a sharp look, almost maternal, but mixed with her own unease. "Peter, don't start. The kids are already on edge." But Peter wasn't joking. He leaned back, his chair creaking against the wooden floor, and his gaze fixed itself on the dim ceiling, as though he could see something through it, something hidden in the bones of the house. Chris followed his father's gaze, his wide eyes mirroring that same eerie focus, as though he too could sense something above them, something crouching quietly in the attic space. Brian, sitting with his paws neatly placed on the floor, exhaled heavily. "You're not wrong, Peter. This place, it's always been strange. There are drafts with no windows open, creaks with no footsteps. Sometimes at night, I swear I hear whispers coming from the walls." That sentence fell like a stone in still water. Whispers in the walls. It hung there, daring anyone to laugh, but no one did. Meg's heart pounded harder, the sound filling her ears until she wondered if the others could hear it too. Then, almost as if the house had been listening, the lights flickered once, twice, before dimming so low that the only glow came from the storm through the window. In that fragile, trembling light, Chris leaned forward. His voice cracked with both fear and curiosity. "What kind of whispers?" Brian tilted his head, his ears twitching. Like someone talking just low enough that you can't make out the words, but you know they're there. And sometimes it's not just one voice, it's more than one. A conversation happening in a place you can't reach." Lois shook her head, gripping her wine glass tighter. "Stop. All of you. It's an old house. Wood shifts, wires buzz, that's all it is. Don't scare the kids." But even her voice faltered, betraying that she wasn't fully convinced. Peter smiled faintly, though it wasn't his usual silly grin. It was tighter, sharper. "Lois, maybe it's not about scaring them. Maybe it's about warning them." The silence that followed was unbearable, thick enough that even the storm outside seemed muted. And then, from somewhere upstairs, there came a sound, a dragging, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across the attic floor. The family froze. No one moved and no one breathed. The sound stopped after a few moments, but it had already done its job. It had woven itself into their fear. Meg finally found her voice, though it came out in a whisper. "See? You heard that, right?" Brian's ears were still perked, his eyes locked on the ceiling. "Yeah," he said softly, "and I think it hurt us too." The weight of that statement pressed down on them, and without another word, Lois stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "That's it. Everyone to the living room. We'll stay together until the storm passes." They gathered themselves quickly, moving as though the very act of leaving the table could protect them. But as they filed into the living room, the house seemed to follow them, the groans of its wooden frame echoing behind, the walls alive with whispers only half heard. In the living room, Lois lit more candles, their flames fragile and small against the vastness of the storm. The family sat close, almost huddled, the flickering light painting their faces in shades of fear. Peter, who usually filled silences with nonsense, stayed quiet, his eyes shifting toward the darkened staircase that led upward. He couldn't help but feel that whatever was in this house wasn't just in the attic. It was in the very air around them, in the walls, in the shadows where the candlelight couldn't reach. Brian finally broke the silence, his voice low. "There's something I never told you. A long time ago, before you guys moved in, there were stories about this place. Neighbors said they'd see lights in the windows at night when it was empty. Figures moving from room to room. They said sometimes, if you stood outside, you could hear laughter, like a party was going on inside. But the house was locked up." Chris swallowed hard, his voice small. "Like ghosts?" Brian didn't answer. He didn't have to. Peter leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe this house is holding on to something. Maybe it doesn't want us here." Meg hugged her arms around herself, her body tense. "Then why do we stay? Why don't we just leave?" Lois placed a hand on Meg's shoulder, squeezing it with a mother's protective strength. "Because this is our home, and no matter what's in it, we don't run." The storm raged outside, lightning splitting the sky into shards of white and blue. And in that brief illumination, through the window, Meg thought she saw something. A figure standing in the yard, still and tall, watching the house. But when the darkness returned, it was gone. She wanted to tell the others, but the words froze in her throat. Instead, she glanced at Chris, and the look on his face told her he had seen it too. The room grew heavier, the silence almost unbearable, when suddenly, from deep within the house, a sound emerged, a soft laugh. Not the laugh of any of them, not even Peter's unmistakable chuckle. It was distant, but close enough to feel like it came from just beyond the wall. The family froze, every candle flickering as though the laugh had passed through them. Peter's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Looks like the party's already started." And with that, the sense of dread transformed into something deeper, something older, as though the house itself had been waiting for this moment. The storm, the whispers, the laughter, they weren't random. They were invitations. The Griffins sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. None of them dared to admit it aloud, but they all felt it. They weren't alone in this house, and whatever shared their space wasn't just passing through, it was staying. It's in these moments of reflection, where the satirical bite of the show is softened, that the depth of Family Guy's narrative begins to emerge. What may look like a disposable gag at first, Peter losing his job, Meg being humiliated at school, Stewie plotting revenge with a diabolical flair, becomes, when viewed collectively, a tapestry of resilience, absurdity, and a strange kind of honesty about modern American life. The Griffins endure not because they solve their problems neatly, but because the problems themselves become part of their identity. The chaos is stitched into the fabric of their daily existence, and somehow, against all odds, they continue to stand together under one roof, even when it seems that roof should have caved in long ago. Take Peter, for example. We ended the last part considering how his flaws are often the catalyst for disaster. But those flaws are also the strange glue that holds the family dynamic together. He is reckless, childish, and often blind to consequence. Yet his antics draw the family into situations that force them to adapt, confront, or rediscover who they are in the face of absurdity. In a way, Peter's failures are the stage upon which the rest of the Griffin family performs their truest selves. And while that may seem dysfunctional, it creates a rhythm of storytelling that defines the show's long life. The humor, then, is never just about laughs. It's about survival. Family Guy's satire exposes the fragility of suburban life, pointing out that beneath the white picket fence illusion of security, every family struggles with uncertainty, with missteps, and with forces larger than themselves. Yet by cloaking those truths in comedy, the show allows us to approach uncomfortable realities with a smirk rather than despair. In laughing at the Griffins, we are perhaps laughing at ourselves, at the chaotic patterns that make up the unpredictability of human living. Lois, meanwhile, becomes the unspoken backbone in these scenarios. She is often portrayed as the voice of reason, the one who tempers Peter's destructive urges or grounds the children when their lives spin out of orbit. Yet Lois is not immune to her own flaws. She is complex, layered, and at times just as impulsive as the rest of the family, making choices that can be just as questionable as Peter's. But in her, the show locates a balance, a reminder that even within chaos, there can be structure, however fragile. Lois represents the negotiation that most families live through, the constant attempt to maintain order without smothering individuality. Then there's the undercurrent of loneliness that flows quietly beneath Meg and Chris. Their struggles are different, but they intersect in the sense that both children constantly strive for recognition and value. Meg's ridicule is a recurring gag, yet underneath it lies the poignant story of an adolescent trying to define herself in a world and in a household that rarely acknowledges her worth. Chris, on the other hand, is painted as dim-witted but lovable, often underestimated even when he displays surprising moments of clarity. Both characters serve as reflections of what it means to grow up under the weight of being overshadowed, and their arcs, though subtle, give the series a tender and human dimension that balances out the wild surrealism. And then, of course, there's Stewie, forever perched at the intersection of genius and immaturity, menace and vulnerability. His schemes of world domination are legendary, but beneath the satire lies a character who encapsulates the contradictions of existence: brilliance without direction, ambition without fulfillment, a sharp wit masking emotional wounds. Stewie is both the outlier and the mirror of the family. Through his voice, the show often critiques society most directly, his sophisticated vocabulary contrasting comically against his infant body. Yet in quieter moments, he reveals the longing for connection and acceptance that every member of the Griffin family shares. Brian, too, occupies a similar space. As the talking dog, he functions simultaneously as observer and participant. He is the character who most often breaks the wall between parody and reflection, embodying both intellect and insecurity. His failures, romantic, professional, personal, serve as constant reminders that intelligence alone is not a guarantee of stability or happiness. Through Brian, Family Guy critiques the pretensions of modern culture, exposing the gaps between who we think we are and how we actually live. All of these threads, Peter's recklessness, Lois's balancing act, Meg's invisibility, Chris's quiet innocence, Stewie's contradictions, and Brian's self-awareness, interweave into a family unit that is at once dysfunctional and strangely functional. And that duality is what gives Family Guy its staying power. The Griffins are not a family that thrives despite chaos. They thrive because of it. The absurdity becomes their shared language, their survival mechanism, their way of making sense of a world that often doesn't make sense at all. As we close this first chapter, it becomes clear that Family Guy is not just about jokes or cutaways, but about a rhythm of resilience. The Griffins stumble, they fail, they embarrass themselves and each other, but they keep going. In the end, the chaos becomes a comfort, a reminder that imperfection is not only inevitable, but strangely unifying. It binds them together, even when everything else seems to fall apart. The city of Quahog, the familiar streets, the ever-changing absurdities that shape their days, all of these form a backdrop to a story that is bigger than any single gag. It is a story about endurance, about family, about the hidden strength that emerges when life refuses to follow the script. The Griffins endure because they adapt, and in adapting, they reveal something deeply human about us all. And so, with this reflection, the curtain gently falls on the first chapter of our exploration. We've walked through the doorway of the Griffin household, peered into the oddity of their daily lives, and traced the outlines of a family that thrives not in spite of its flaws, but because of them. As night settles over Spooner Street, the house stands once more in its quiet silhouette. Peter perhaps asleep in front of the TV, Lois finally catching a breath, the children tucked away in rooms that echo with their unspoken struggles. It is here, in this stillness after chaos, that we prepare to step into the next stage of their story. Chapter 2 awaits, promising to peel back even more of the hidden layers, the vulnerabilities, the secrets, the emotional fractures, and the connections that lie beneath the laughter. For now, though, let us linger a moment in the silence of Quahog at night, where the Griffin home sits bathed in a sleepy glow, ready for another day of absurdity when the sun rises again. And so, as Chapter 1 closed with the vision of Peter's strange relationship with power and indulgence, the echoes of that dynamic linger like a shadow stretching across generations. Yet to truly understand the lore of Peter Griffin, one must look not only at the man himself, but also at the forces that shaped him. The family he came from, the chaos of his childhood, and the small-town world that molded the loud, clumsy father of Quahog into what he is today. The curtain rises again, softly, with the sounds of a neighborhood tucked away in fading memory, where the whispers of the past still linger, shaping every laugh, every mistake, every choice Peter would one day make. Chapter 2 opens quietly, as though easing into an old photograph. We step back to Peter's childhood, a time when the Griffin family name was nothing more than a blur of dysfunction stitched together with moments of bizarre tenderness. His father, Francis Griffin, stood like an immovable wall of stern Catholic morality, a man whose life was dedicated to rigidity, rules, and unshakable faith. Francis was the kind of father whose love came not through affection, but through commands and expectations, his booming voice echoing in Peter's memory as a constant presence. For young Peter, growing up in the shadow of such discipline was both a cage and a crucible. Peter's mother, Thelma Griffin, was gentler but not without her quirks. She embodied the archetype of a tired, no-nonsense mother who balanced survival with humor. Though not as cruel as Frances, she too was shaped by hardship, her affection often masked beneath sarcasm and exasperation. Thelma's presence, though understated, planted in Peter the seeds of humor and resilience, the sense that laughter could soften the edges of even the hardest truths. Their household was far from harmonious. It was a place where Catholic guilt hung in the air as thickly as the smell of dinner, where expectations clashed with reality, and where Peter learned that the rules imposed on him didn't always align with the absurdity of life he saw unfolding around him. He was a boy torn between obeying and rebelling, between wanting approval and chasing fun. These tensions simmered quietly in him. And though he grew into a man who seemed careless deep within, the push and pull of those early years never left. School life for Peter only deepened this paradox. He was never the brightest student. His report cards were a collection of mediocrity, but his ability to entertain, to make others laugh, and to transform embarrassment into comedy became his armor. Teachers found him frustrating, classmates found him hilarious, and Peter himself began to see the world less as a place of order and more as a playground for chaos. He developed an instinct for turning punishment into performance, a skill that would later define him as the center of attention, even when he didn't intend to be. And yet, beneath the jokes, Peter was often lonely. His larger-than-life antics masked insecurities, a desire to be loved and accepted that was never fully satisfied in his childhood home. When Frances scolded him, it wasn't just discipline, it was rejection. When Thelma sighed at his mistakes, Peter felt the weight of disappointment. These small fractures added up, shaping a man who would later search for love, validation, and belonging in all the wrong and often hilarious places. As he grew older, Peter's friendships began to define him as much as his family. Though his adult life would cement bonds with characters like Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe, the roots of Peter's need for camaraderie go all the way back to his youth. He found solace in friends who didn't care about grades, expectations, or discipline, but instead valued his humor and presence. In these small circles, Peter discovered freedom, a sense that even if he wasn't successful by the standards of his parents or his school, he could still matter by making others laugh. This foundation, built from dysfunction at home and refuge among friends, created the Peter Griffin we know today, a man constantly swinging between insecurity and overconfidence, between chaos and comfort, between the desire to lead and the need to escape responsibility. Every misadventure, every ridiculous scheme, and every stumble into trouble is rooted in this childhood cocktail of harsh discipline, misunderstood affection, and a desperate search for validation. But childhood wasn't only about hardship. There were moments of joy, too, moments that would stay with Peter like warm embers in a storm. The times when Thelma's patience shone through, when a rare smile from Frances felt like victory, when jokes with friends made the world feel lighter. These glimpses of happiness kept Peter from being completely consumed by the shadows of his upbringing. They became the seeds of the relentless humor he carried into adulthood, the laughter that both shielded him and defined him. As the story continues, the scene shifts to Peter's young adulthood, when the world beyond his parents' walls began to open up. It was a time of experimentation, of discovering who he was outside of the Griffin household. Though he lacked direction, Peter was armed with humor and resilience, stumbling his way through jobs, relationships, and responsibilities with the same clumsy charm that would one day make him both beloved and infamous. This transition, from childhood to adulthood, was messy. Jobs were lost as quickly as they were gained. Relationships flickered, often sabotaged by Peter's immaturity. Yet through all the chaos, there was a persistent thread: Peter's ability to survive, to find his footing no matter how many times he tripped. It was as though his chaotic upbringing had trained him to live in a world where nothing made sense, a world where absurdity reigned supreme. Here, too, the shadows of Frances and Thelma followed him. Frances's voice remained in Peter's mind, criticizing, judging, demanding better. Thelma's sighs still haunted him, echoes of disappointment lingering in quiet moments. And yet these ghosts only pushed Peter further toward humor as both weapon and shield. He laughed at the world before it could laugh at him, and in doing so, carved out a strange, fumbling path into adulthood. As the first segment of Chapter 2 unfolds, it becomes clear that Peter's lore is not just about the man who became the father of Quahog, but about the boy who struggled beneath the weight of expectations, the young man who stumbled through life, and the echoes of a family whose love was as flawed as it was formative. To understand Peter fully is to understand the Griffin household, a place where laughter was survival, where chaos was constant, and where the seeds of absurdity were sown deep. And so the chapter begins to close its first part with an image of Peter at the threshold of adulthood. The boy who grew up in a world of contradictions is now a man stepping into the unknown, armed with nothing but humor, clumsiness, and a heart shaped by rejection and resilience. It is here that the lore takes root, where the foundation of Peter's bizarre, chaotic life is revealed not as accident, but as inevitability. The story pauses here, lingering in this moment of transition, before moving deeper into the saga of Peter's early adulthood, where the mistakes would grow larger, the consequences sharper, and the legend of Peter Griffin truly begin to take shape. Peter's story, as we left him, had settled into that familiar air of contradictions, his heart full of love for his family, yet his footsteps often carrying him towards trouble. The barroom lessons of Chapter 1 gave us a window into his chaos, but now, as the lights dim in that corner of Quahog, the story shifts into the quiet hours of night where Peter's dreams open up new pathways to explore. Family Guy has always taken Peter's subconscious and turned it into a stage of absurdity, a dreamscape where the rules of logic bend and yet reveal truths about who he really is. And in this chapter, we enter those very dreams, standing beside him as he drifts in and out of visions that both entertain and haunt. It begins with Peter asleep in his recliner, the television flickering with static. The sound of the late-night channel fades into the low hum of his breathing, but within moments the static transforms into something far stranger. Suddenly, Peter is no longer in his living room. He's in a vast field of clouds, surrounded by characters he's known throughout his life, each one exaggerated, each one glowing with surreal significance. Ernie, the giant chicken, is there, towering even larger than before, feathers glinting like polished steel, his eyes burning with the suggestion of yet another fight. And in the far distance, Peter spots his family, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, and even Brian, all gathered around a campfire, waving for him to join. Yet as Peter walks toward them, the ground beneath him shifts. The clouds melt into pavement, the stars disappear, and suddenly he's standing in the middle of Spooner Street. The dream folds into reality, yet something feels off. Every house is perfectly identical, each one glowing with a golden light, as though Quahog itself has been remade into an echo of his subconscious. It's here that the dreamscape begins to unravel his fears and desires. For in every window of every house, Peter sees moments of his own life replaying. There he is marrying Lois. There he is holding baby Stewie. There he is crashing his car into a mailbox. And in another window, he sees himself older, alone, staring at a blank television he saws the screen. The dream reminds him, sometimes with humor, sometimes with dread, that life passes quickly, and that even in his foolishness, he longs to be remembered. The surreal, almost haunting quality of Peter's dreams isn't far from the way Family Guy itself often dances between comedy and commentary. In this dream sequence chapter, his mind acts as the stage for what he can't say aloud. He jokes in waking life. He distracts himself with food, drink, and television, but in sleep, his subconscious strips away those distractions, and in the silence, Peter faces truths he'd rather avoid. As the dream unfolds, a door appears in the middle of the street. Its frame stands alone without walls, glowing faintly under a dream moon. Peter approaches, curious, and when he opens it, he finds himself in the drunken clam. But this isn't the clam of waking life. The bar is endless, stretching far into the distance, every stool occupied by a different version of Peter Griffin. Each one represents a path he could have taken. A firefighter Peter, a professor Peter, a Peter who never married Lois, a Peter who lived in a different city, even a Peter who never existed in Quahog at all. They sit with beers in hand, laughing and talking, a chorus of possibilities. Peter walks between them, hearing fragments of their conversations. One Peter talks about missing out on family because he chose a career. Another laments a life where he never found friends like Cleveland, Joe, and Quagmire. Yet another insists that none of it matters, that as long as there's beer and laughter, life is worth living. The surreal humor of it all fits perfectly into the Family Guy style, but beneath it lies an unsettling thought, that Peter, in all his silliness, knows deep down how fragile and fleeting his choices are. And then, as if pulled by an invisible hand, Peter is drawn to the far end of the dream bar. There, under a single spotlight, sits the Grim Reaper. Not death as a stranger, but death as Peter knows him. Sarcastic, oddly casual, holding his scythe as though it were no heavier than a cane. Funny thing about choices, Peter, Death says in his dry voice. You only ever notice them when it's too late. The words sting, but in the dream, Peter can only nod, because no matter how ridiculous his waking antics may be, even he cannot laugh away the inevitability of mortality. The dream doesn't end there. It shifts again, this time whisking Peter into a strange, carnival-like world where the rides are shaped like televisions, where the prizes are giant donuts, and where the announcer over the loudspeaker repeats, "Step right up, relive your favorite mistakes." Peter rides a roller coaster that swoops past memories, his failed jobs, his impulsive decisions, his thoughtless mistakes, but also flashes of warmth, the birth of his children, his wedding day, his moments of laughter with friends. It is chaotic, colorful, loud, and yet deeply revealing. For all the times Peter fails, there is something undeniably human about his persistence. The surreal carnival fades into silence, and Peter finds himself back in his recliner, asleep in his living room. The dream lingers in the air, a memory within a memory. He stirs, mutters something incoherent, and the television flickers once more. On the screen, the static clears into a rerun of a sitcom, one of those nameless shows he half watches, half forgets. And though he doesn't realize it consciously, the dream has etched itself deeper than any punchline. This segment of the story invites us into Peter's subconscious not simply for humor, but for meaning. It reminds us that beneath the laughter, beneath the reckless antics, Peter is a man aware, at least in fleeting moments, of his own mortality and his own desire for legacy. He wants to be remembered not for his failures or his foolishness, but for his laughter, his heart, and the strange, chaotic love he brings to his family and friends. As the chapter continues, we will linger in these dream visions, peeling back the layers of Peter Griffin's mind, uncovering truths hidden behind his jokes. For now, as the night deepens and the quiet hum of Quahog settles in, we hold on to that image of Peter in his chair, dreaming a dream that says more than words ever could. The streets of Quahog felt like they were whispering secrets only Peter could hear, even if most of it was just the sound of rain running down gutters and the faint hum of neon signs. He had left the fading glow of the drunken clam behind him, the last words of the sailor still bouncing around in his skull like echoes in a cave. The sea remembers. It was cryptic, absurd, and yet strangely haunting. Peter, of course, wasn't built for riddles. His mind worked in fragments, in flashes, in sudden leaps that often missed the ground. But tonight there was something different. He could feel the weight of that phrase, as though it wasn't just a passing drunk's ramble, but a message meant for him alone. His shoes splashed through the shallow puddles as he walked, the glow of the streetlight stretching his shadow long and distorted, like a giant looming over him. At home, The Griffin house was still, except for the faint creaks and groans of the old wood adjusting in the damp night. Lois had fallen asleep on the couch, a book half open on her chest, her soft breathing mingling with the low drone of the television left on in the background. Stewie's room glowed faintly from a nightlight, though the baby himself was wide awake, fiddling with schematics for something too complicated for anyone else in the family to understand. And upstairs in Chris's room, posters of superheroes loomed silently over his bed as he snored, lost in his own simple dreams. Everything seemed ordinary, but Peter carried the night with him as he slipped inside, wet footprints trailing from the door. He didn't go to bed right away. Instead, he found himself pacing the kitchen, pulling open the fridge not because he was hungry, but because staring into its pale blue light was easier than facing the silence. A half-empty carton of milk, some takeout leftovers, and a suspicious jar of something green were all that stared back. Yet behind them, in that faint light, Peter thought he saw the shimmer of waves again, as if the ocean had followed him home. He blinked, shut the fridge door, and rubbed his eyes. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the beer. Or maybe the sailor's words had set loose something that had been waiting all along. The night wore on. Hours passed, measured only by the ticking clock in the living room. And as the stillness deepened, Peter finally fell asleep at the kitchen table, head resting against his folded arms. Dreams came fast and heavy, like waves crashing against his mind. He was standing on a shoreline, the moon high and swollen above the water. The waves were enormous, each one whispering something different as it broke. Words too quick to catch, too faint to grasp. The sea stretched endless and black, dotted only by flickers of pale light deep beneath the surface. And there, standing on the horizon, was a shape he could barely comprehend. Something vast, something that breathed with the rhythm of the tides, something that seemed to know his name. Peter. The voice was low, drawn out, more vibration than sound. It carried with it a pull, a demand, as though the ocean itself wanted him to step closer. He did. His feet sank into the wet sand, water swirling around his ankles as he waded deeper. The sea welcomed him, swallowed him, until the shore was gone. He drifted, weightless, surrounded by endless black. And then he saw it. An eye, massive and glowing faintly from the abyss. It was watching him, patient and ancient, as though it had been waiting for this meeting for centuries. Peter tried to speak, but only bubbles escaped his mouth. He struggled, twisting in the dark water, yet something held him still. The voice returned, vibrating through his bones. The sea remembers. You cannot run. The words echoed endlessly, each one pounding against his skull until he jolted awake, gasping at the kitchen table, sweat dripping down his forehead. His chest heaved as he looked around. He was safe in his house, with nothing but the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock, and yet that eye still burned in his memory, etched like a scar he couldn't shake. The following morning, the world looked deceptively normal. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Lois made coffee, and Stewie muttered to himself about flawed quantum mechanics, as if nothing strange had happened. But Peter carried the weight of the night in his eyes, and for once, his usual bumbling demeanor was shadowed by something else, unease. He didn't tell Lois about the dream. He didn't tell Brian or even Quagmire when they met later in the day. But the phrase gnawed at him, chewing on the edges of his thoughts. The sea remembers. By the afternoon, Peter found himself drawn back to the docks. The salty air stung his nose, the gulls circled overhead, and the water slapped lazily against the rotting wood. He looked for the sailor, but he was nowhere to be found. Instead, the pier was quiet. the boats swaying gently in their moorings, ropes creaking with the current. Peter leaned against the railing, staring out at the horizon. The ocean looked so calm, so harmless in the daylight, but he knew better now. He had seen what lingered beneath. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted movement. A boy, no older than 10, was standing near the edge of the pier, staring intently into the water. His clothes were soaked, his hair dripping, as if he had just climbed from the sea. But Peter hadn't seen him arrive, hadn't heard a splash. The boy turned his head slowly, eyes too pale, too cold, and met Peter's gaze. For a moment, the world seemed to still. Then the boy whispered, so softly Peter almost didn't hear it. The sea remembers. And just like that, he was gone, vanished, leaving behind only ripples in the water where he had stood. Peter stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't just dreams or drunken rambling anymore. Something was happening, something that had seeped into the real world. The sailor, the dream, the boy, they were all threads of the same pattern, leading him deeper into whatever mystery the sea held. He didn't know why it had chosen him. He didn't know what it wanted, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sharp tang of salt and the distant crash of waves. Peter stood frozen at the edge of the pier, staring into the shifting water as if waiting for it to reveal its secrets. Behind him, the familiar laughter of quahog life continued. Children playing, cars passing, voices drifting from nearby shops. But it all felt muted, far away like another world entirely. His world had shifted, tilted, and there was no turning back now. And in that quiet, with the ocean stretching endless before him, Peter whispered the words back, almost involuntarily. The sea remembers. And so, from that strange intersection of affection and irritation, the fabric of Peter's life wove itself into moments that were less about grand design and more about accidents that turned into stories. It was never deliberate, never orchestrated with clarity, but always impactful in its own peculiar way. And from those moments, the lore deepened, because Family Guy was not just a sitcom where things reset, but a series where echoes of chaos lingered, where episodes piled up like layers of memory, and where Peter's bizarre choices became cultural touchstones. In one stretch of his story, Peter's attempts at responsibility were tested. He found himself involved in Quahog's civic duties, not because he sought them out, but because chance pushed him into those roles. At one point, he ran for a public position, completely ill-equipped, yet strangely persuasive to those who couldn't resist his comedic blundering. The sight of Peter in a suit, speaking nonsense with confidence, became a metaphor for how often misplaced charm carries weight in real-world authority. The humor in this wasn't just about a man acting out of place. It was about exposing how fragile systems of power really are, how easily disrupted they become when someone unserious wields influence. But Peter's public life was only one strand of his sprawling existence. Another thread was his relentless relationship with obsession. Whether it was starting a new hobby, forming a short-lived band, or dedicating himself to bizarre fads, Peter was driven by impulses that burned bright but fast. One day it was collectible toys, the next day it was inventing an outlandish idea for television. And the day after that, it was something as simple as becoming fixated on a food trend. These patterns weren't mere gags. They reflected the way Peter embodied the extremes of enthusiasm, a trait so many of us recognize. His obsessions were our obsessions exaggerated, silly, fleeting, yet somehow deeply human. Of course, Behind these obsessions were his family's responses. Lois often became the anchor, a voice both loving and exasperated, while the kids alternated between reluctant participants and sharp commentators on their father's antics. And yet, no matter how absurd the setup became, the core dynamic always remained. Peter was both a burden and a source of joy. He pulled his family into whirlwinds of nonsense, but he also gave them stories, memories that, even within the show's constant resets, lingered as markers of shared absurdity. Then there was the lore that stretched outside the domestic walls of the Griffin household. Peter's friendships, especially with Cleveland, Joe, and Quagmire, became extensions of his personality, amplifying his strengths and flaws alike. These friends didn't just accompany him, they often acted as mirrors, reflecting back parts of Peter that were hard to notice within the family setting. With Quagmire, the reckless indulgence was magnified. With Joe, the attempts at leadership and camaraderie stood out. With Cleveland, the balance of humor and restraint was revealed. In their shared adventures at the Drunken Clam, Peter became more than a father or husband. He became the embodiment of camaraderie and recklessness, a symbol of how shared foolishness can create unbreakable bonds. These friendships also birthed some of the most memorable lore moments, ones where the simple act of hanging out unraveled into sprawling adventures. Trips gone wrong, half-baked schemes, and nights at the bar that spiraled into wild misadventures. All of these gave the show its rhythm, its heart, its capacity to feel both grounded and surreal at once. And through it all, Peter stood at the center, not always as the hero, but always as the gravitational pull. Yet, it's impossible to discuss Peter without acknowledging his darker sides. His impulsivity was not always harmless. Sometimes it led to genuine cruelty, moments where his selfishness caused pain, not just in slapstick form, but in emotional undercurrents. The lore of Peter Griffin isn't just comedic. It's complicated by these shadows, by the instances where humor brushes against the edges of discomfort. It is in those moments that the character feels less like a cartoon and more like a satirical portrait of human weakness. One such instance lies in Peter's recurring habit of carelessness with his relationships, whether it was forgetting anniversaries, making decisions that jeopardized his marriage, or treating his children with a blend of neglect and comic indifference. Peter often tested the boundaries of love, and yet, somehow the story always circled back to forgiveness. Lois forgave him, his children tolerated him, and his friends continued to laugh with him. This cycle wasn't a failure of storytelling. It was the very essence of lore. Peter Griffin embodied the paradox of being both unforgivable and endlessly forgiven. The lore deepens when you look at the surreal episodes where reality itself bends around Peter. Moments when he battles giant chickens in drawn-out cinematic fights that parody action films, or when he shifts into alternate timelines and multiverses. These battles and distortions weren't random. They became markers of Peter's mythic scale. He wasn't just a father from Quahog anymore. He was a cultural figure who could cross genres, bend reality, and still return home to dinner as if nothing had happened. That duality, the myth and the mundane, is what makes the Peter Griffin lore so enduring. The chicken fights especially became symbolic. Each one wasn't just a gag, it was a saga. Their sheer length and ridiculous escalation made them unforgettable, echoing across episodes like recurring battles in a legend. To the casual viewer, they were absurd interruptions. But to those tracing the lore, they became narrative anchors, proof that in Peter's world, grudges lasted, conflicts carried on, and no amount of destruction could stop the cycle from repeating. It was myth-making disguised as slapstick, storytelling disguised as nonsense. As the chapter of lore continued, Peter's existence began to feel like an echo chamber of cultural commentary. His character wasn't just built to make people laugh. He was built to expose contradictions in American life. Through his ignorance, the show highlighted issues of politics, culture, and society. Through his exaggerations, it revealed truths that were often uncomfortable. And through his absurdity, it mirrored the absurdity of the world we inhabit. And so when we look at Peter Griffin, not just as a man, but as a symbol, his story expands beyond Quahog. He becomes a legend of animated storytelling, a character who thrives not because he's perfect, but because he is so profoundly flawed. His lore is a collection of mistakes, victories, obsessions, battles, friendships, and betrayals, woven together in a way that no single episode can contain, but which every episode contributes to. It is here that the rhythm of Peter's story shifts. As if the weight of his legacy cannot be carried by jokes alone, the narrative begins to feel dreamlike, haunted by his contradictions. He is both loved and resented, celebrated and mocked, a hero and a fool. That tension is the essence of his lore, and it is what pulls us deeper into the unfolding chapters of his life. Chris's inner world, though often laughed off by others, was never truly empty. His mind contained echoes, shadows of thoughts and feelings that sometimes surfaced at unexpected moments. The scene at the kitchen table, where his family carried on without pausing to consider the depth of his silence, stayed with him as he retreated upstairs. Chris had grown accustomed to the role of background character in his own home, the Griffin household revolving around Peter's antics, Lois's frustrations, Stewie's machinations, and Brian's self-reflections. But even when left unseen, Chris carried within him quiet storms, miniature worlds that no one else could see. In his room, posters of heavy metal bands lined the walls, loud in their imagery but silent in their comfort. Chris had always turned to art, doodling in notebooks or sketching on scrap paper, filling margins with warriors, dragons, and surreal landscapes that only made sense to him. They were worlds where he wasn't mocked, where his size wasn't a punchline, and his confusion wasn't a target. Instead, in those drawings, Chris became a knight, a guardian, sometimes even a hero. His pencil could do for him what words could not, give shape to the chaos inside his head. At school, though, these drawings rarely made it past the secrecy of his backpack. He knew what would happen if others saw them. Bullies like Neil Goldman, or even worse, the background characters who seemed to appear just to remind him of his failures, would make sure he regretted sharing anything vulnerable. And so Chris learned the strange art of duality, being the visible Griffin child who barely scraped by in classes, and the invisible dreamer who, in the privacy of his room, created entire universes. What was rarely acknowledged, however, was the fact that Chris had a sense of awareness about his invisibility. Unlike Meg, who often voiced her pain, Chris's struggle was quieter. He didn't shout about being ignored. He simply absorbed it, let it sink into his being until it became part of the fabric of his personality. His identity wasn't fully about being overlooked. It was about how he learned to live in the shadows and sometimes even thrive in them. But shadows can be deceptive, and living in them too long can make them feel permanent. There were nights Chris would sit at his desk, staring at his drawings, feeling the weight of questions he couldn't ask aloud. Did his family really know him? Would they ever take the time to listen if he spoke from his heart? Or was his role destined to remain what it always seemed to be? The awkward son, the dim-witted brother, the boy who never quite fit. One of the strangest ironies about Chris was that even in his obscurity, he sometimes became the accidental center of attention. There were episodes where his bizarre tendencies, like befriending a homicidal pedophile or crafting oddly unsettling art pieces, brought him into the spotlight. But even then, the spotlight never seemed to shine with genuine interest. It was always comedic, satirical, a way for the universe of Family Guy to laugh at him rather than see him. This cyclical pattern reinforced the idea that Chris was only seen when the joke demanded it, and never when his heart did. In the quiet of his room, he often wondered about what it would mean to be truly understood. His mind would wander into dreamy sequences where his family celebrated him, respected him, or even leaned on him for guidance. In these visions, Peter would look at him not as the simple-minded son, but as someone who carried unexpected wisdom. Lois would acknowledge that beneath his confusion lived a sensitive soul who wanted desperately to do right by his family. Meg might even turn to him for sibling solidarity rather than wallowing in her own despair. And Stewie would probably still mock him, but in Chris's dreams, even Stewie's barbs carried a strange kind of affection. And yet reality always pulled him back. Downstairs, laughter would erupt over one of Peter's impulsive antics, or Stewie's elaborate plans would become the center of attention. Chris's fantasies would fade into the background noise of the Griffin house, reminding him once again that his role was not to shine, but to drift quietly, occasionally breaking into the surface only when comedy required it. What makes Chris compelling, and perhaps haunting, is this duality. He exists in a space between recognition and dismissal, visibility and invisibility. The audience knows him. We watch him, laugh at his absurdities, sometimes pity him, but rarely take the time to dig deeper. His family mirrors this same distance, interacting with him, but rarely engaging with the depths he carries. The tragedy, if one can call it that, is that Chris does have depths. They are simply too quiet, too hidden, too overshadowed by the louder personalities in his orbit. Sometimes, though, the show gives us fleeting glimpses of those depths, moments that feel almost accidental, like a curtain pulling back before snapping shut again. One such moment comes when Chris reveals an uncanny artistic talent. In a surreal twist, his drawings veer into the disturbing, filled with grotesque imagery that unnerves even his parents. It's easy to dismiss this as just another comedic gag, but beneath it lies something more profound. Chris sees the world differently. His brain processes feelings and images in ways that his family doesn't always understand. His art, unsettling as it might be, is a translation of emotions he cannot put into words. And isn't that, in many ways, the mark of someone overlooked, to express the inexpressible in ways others might never grasp? Chris's creativity, misunderstood though it may be, is proof that invisibility does not mean emptiness. It is proof that shadows, when examined closely, contain colors of their own. If the Griffin family were to pause just for a moment, they might see what the audience sometimes glimpses. That Chris is not merely the forgotten son or the butt of yet another joke. He is a young man navigating the difficult terrain of adolescence, identity, and invisibility, all while living in a house that thrives on chaos. His silence, his confusion, and even his comedic failures mask a search for meaning that deserves acknowledgement. Yet this acknowledgement rarely comes. And so Chris continues to float, neither fully embraced nor fully discarded, existing in the liminal space of comic relief. But perhaps that's where his haunting quality lies. Because in that liminal space, Chris becomes a mirror. He reflects the parts of us that sometimes feel unseen, unheard, or dismissed. He embodies the experience of those who are overshadowed by louder voices, those who have something to offer but lack the stage to present it. As the chapter edges toward its close, Chris sits once more at his desk, pencil in hand, shading in the lines of another sketch. Outside, the Griffin household is alive with noise. Peter's booming laughter, Lois's exasperation, Meg's sighs, Stewie's plotting, and Brian's commentary. All of it swirls together, a cacophony that doesn't reach the quiet sanctuary of Chris's room. Here, in this bubble, he is free to create, to imagine, to exist without judgment. The storm of invisibility may rage on outside, but inside, Chris has carved out a fragile peace. And as his pencil moves across the paper, we're reminded that invisibility does not mean absence. Chris is there, shaping his own world, even if no one else cares to see it. His story is one of hidden resilience, a quiet endurance that hums beneath the louder arcs of the Griffin family's art. You know, dear, the truth is, Chris may never fully escape the role assigned to him. The world of Family Guy is not designed for resolution or growth. It thrives on repetition, on resetting the pieces for the next gag. But within that repetition, within that endless cycle of being overlooked, Chris persists. His invisibility becomes not just a condition, but a form of quiet rebellion. He continues to exist, continues to create, continues to dream, even when the world forgets he is there. And maybe, just maybe, that persistence is enough. Because sometimes the most haunting stories are not about those who shout the loudest, but about those who remain, silently shaping their own existence in the shadows. Chris Griffin is one such story, an echo in the chaos, a whisper in the noise, a presence in the invisibility. With that, Chapter 2 draws to a close. We leave Chris in his room, the glow of a small lamp illuminating his sketches while the laughter of his family echoes faintly through the walls. The shadows lengthen, the pencil continues its quiet journey across the page, and we are left to wonder, what other hidden worlds lie in the silence of those we so easily overlook? The storm that had gathered in Peter's subconscious during the previous episodes of his life had not fully cleared. The quiet reflections of his missteps, his jokes that sometimes landed like thunderclaps, and the painful silences that followed his most foolish actions still lingered like distant echoes. When we last left him, the weight of his legacy, however absurd or twisted, hung heavily in the air as though his own laughter could no longer disguise the shadows creeping in behind it. Now, as we step into the next chapter, those shadows thicken, curling around the strange contradictions of Peter Griffin himself. He is a man who wears foolishness like a crown, yet whose presence shapes the lives of those around him in ways even he does not fully comprehend. It is here, in this hazy territory between humor and tragedy, that the next layer of his story begins to unfold. For much of his life, Peter's choices have seemed random, like tossing darts blindfolded in a crowded room. Some land on laughter, some on disaster, and others on wounds that never quite heal. But beneath this randomness lies something deeper, a rhythm, almost a destiny, as though his life is propelled by a chaotic yet unrelenting force. Peter may not notice it, but the world around him bends slightly with his weight, reshaping itself with every blunder, every laugh, every regret. And now, as he lumbers through another evening, beer in hand, eyes half-focused on a television screen filled with mindless chatter, something unusual stirs within him. It begins with a dream. Peter drifts off on the couch, his snores rattling like an old engine. But behind his eyelids, an entirely different world begins to play. At first, it looks like his ordinary surroundings, Quahog with its familiar streets, the drunken clam glowing in the distance, and the Griffin house sitting calmly, as though nothing in the world could shake it. But soon the colors distort. The houses bend at strange angles, the sky turns a bruised shade of violet, and the shadows stretch unnaturally long. Out of this warped landscape, a figure begins to emerge, tall, cloaked, its face hidden beneath a hood. It is the Grim Reaper, but not the goofy acquaintance Peter has seen before in the waking world. No, this version feels heavier, older, like an archetype instead of a friend. This isn't death as Peter knows him, it's death as the universe knows him. The cloaked figure raises a hand, and Peter finds himself standing instead of lying, the dream snapping into sudden clarity. He looks down, and his casual outfit, the white shirt and green pants, are gone. He is dressed in something older, something resembling medieval garb, a tunic and boots that make no sense but somehow feel right in this dreamscape. His heart beats harder, and though his instinct is to laugh it off, the sound dies in his throat. For once, Peter Griffin cannot make a joke. The Grim Reaper speaks, not with the casual tone of a drinking buddy, but with a voice that rolls like thunder across the dream sky. Peter Griffin, it says, your life is not what you believe it to be. Every act of foolishness, every burst of laughter, every shadow of regret, they all weigh upon the scales. You stumble through your days, thinking your choices scatter like leaves in the wind. But they gather, Peter. They always gather. Peter blinks, confused, his mouth opening, ready to fire off a deflection about scales or leaves or something ridiculous. But he cannot. The words stick. For the first time, he feels not like the star of a sitcom, not like the clumsy king of Quahog, but like a man standing at the edge of something vast and terrifying. He looks around, and in the strange dream Quahog, he sees them. Lois, Stewie, Meg, Chris, Brian, all standing in the shadows, watching him silently. Their faces are unreadable, blurred at the edges as though they are both real and not real. Peter takes a shaky step forward. So what? You're here to tell me I'm in trouble? The cloaked figure tilts its head. Not trouble, reckoning. The word slices through the dream, and suddenly the environment begins to crack. The violet sky fractures like glass, and jagged lines of light shine through. The ground beneath Peter's feet tilts, sending him stumbling forward as though he is being pulled towards some invisible point. He reaches out, desperate, and for a moment he sees Lois's hand extended toward him. But before he can grasp it, everything shatters. Peter wakes with a jolt. He is no longer on the couch, though. Somehow, impossibly, he is in his own bed, drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around him like chains. The room feels colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones. He sits up, breathing hard, and for a moment, he swears he sees a shadow move across the room, a cloaked silhouette slipping into the corner. When he blinks, it's gone. Was it a dream? Was it something more? Peter can't tell, but the weight of it lingers, pressing down on his chest. He tries to shake it off, stumbling into the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. Staring into the mirror, he half expects to see that cloaked figure staring back, but it's only him. Peter Griffin, ordinary, foolish, ridiculous. And yet as he looks into his own eyes, he can't help but feel they look a little different. Tired, maybe, older, almost haunted. The rest of the house remains quiet, the usual chaos muted in the middle of the night. But as Peter walks back through the darkened hallway, he notices something strange. On the wall, just by Stewie's door, a small mark has appeared. An odd black smudge, almost like soot, shaped in the faint outline of a scythe. Peter freezes, staring at it, his skin prickling. Then, shaking his head, he mutters to himself, "It's just probably like ketchup or something." But even he doesn't believe it. This moment, the dream, the shadow, the mark, will begin to haunt him in the days to come. It will press at him when he laughs, when he drinks, when he stumbles into another mistake. For though Peter Griffin has always walked a fine line between comedy and chaos, something darker now trails him, whispering in his ear. The reminder that every life, even one as absurd as his, carries weight. And that weight is beginning to tip. As dawn creeps over Quahog, Peter sits quietly at the edge of his bed, staring out the window. He has no words for what he feels. For once, silence suits him. The laughter will return, of course, it always does. But deep inside, Peter knows the Grim Reaper is not finished with him. Not yet. And so begins a new layer of his story, a haunted chapter where the jokes and shadows intertwine, where destiny itself feels like it's watching, waiting. The silence in the Griffin household after those emotional tides of family reflection seemed almost deceptive. It felt calm, but beneath it, subtle waves of tension lingered, rippling just enough to keep the air restless. Peter had spent the last evening rambling about chicken fights and improbable adventures. But behind his jokes, there was a flicker of unease. He might not have been the most self-reflective man in the world, yet even he could sense that the world around him sometimes bent in strange, dreamlike directions. And with that sense came the quiet weight of wondering if it all meant something deeper. Meg had retreated to her room, headphones on, letting music drown out the noise of the world. Chris had disappeared into the basement, losing himself in doodles of strange, half-imagined creatures that seemed too vivid for mere sketching. Lois, ever the quiet pillar of order, busied herself in the kitchen, almost as if movement itself helped her forget the gravity of the moments when silence tried to press too hard. And Stewie was in his nursery, scribbling furious notes into a little red notebook that looked entirely out of place for a baby, but perfectly in place for him. The scene was familiar, yet under that familiarity was an undercurrent that felt heavier. This was where the story turned inward, where the reflection of the Griffins themselves started to blur with the reflection of something larger. The unsettling awareness of existence in a world where they were both characters in a story and people in a family. Peter, sprawled out on the couch, absent-mindedly flipping through channels, muttered to himself, "Why does it always feel like someone's watching me?" His words, though careless, seemed to hang in the air a little too long, almost as if the house itself paused to listen. The television flickered with static for half a moment, before returning to a rerun of one of Quagmire's absurd late-night infomercials. But the pause left Peter staring at the screen longer than he usually would. Lois peeked into the living room, drying her hands with a dish towel. "Peter, are you okay?" she asked gently, her tone laced with the kind of cautious concern she reserved for those rare moments when her husband seemed unsettled in ways that weren't just comically ridiculous. Peter blinked, shaking himself back into his usual persona. "Yeah, Lois, I'm fine. Just, static. Creepy static. Probably just the cable guy not doing his job. Or maybe ghosts. I don't know, I'm not a scientist." Lois sighed, half exasperated, half relieved. His ability to dismiss what might trouble others was sometimes maddening, but tonight she welcomed it. The walls of their home had felt heavier, like the house itself was storing the echoes of their conversations, and she didn't want Peter adding to that unease. Yet upstairs in his nursery, Stewie tapped the tip of his pen against the notebook, muttering under his breath, Yes, of course. The static is not random. It is interference, a signal peeking through the veil. But does the buffoon comprehend it? Of course not. His mind is too steeped in beer and poultry to unravel the complexities of the cosmic curtain. His voice was sharp, but it carried a note of excitement, almost as though the chaos in the air was confirming theories he had long suspected. Down the hallway, Chris sat at his desk, sketching another creature. Its long limbs, hollow eyes, and eerie smile stared back at him from the paper. He tilted his head, frowning. Why do I keep drawing these guys? He whispered to himself. The basement lights flickered once, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw the outline of his drawing standing in the far corner. But when he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the hum of the old basement lamp. Chris rubbed his eyes and forced a laugh. Yeah, just my imagination. Right. Totally normal. People draw creepy monsters all the time. Nothing to worry about. But still, he placed the sketch face down on his desk, as if turning away its gaze would make the lingering discomfort fade. Night fell deeper over Quahog, the rain from earlier leaving the streets slick with reflections that shimmered under the dim glow of the street lamps. The Griffin house stood quiet, but in that quiet, something felt poised to stir. Brian, curled up on the living room rug, lifted his head and stared toward the window. His ears twitched at a sound he couldn't quite place, a low hum, like the faint vibration of electricity. He padded toward the glass, nose pressing against the cool surface. The backyard stretched in shadows, the trees swaying lightly in the wind. But beyond that, near the fence, he thought he saw a faint figure, not fully formed, more like an outline, shifting and flickering with each sway of the branches. Brian blinked, and it was gone. Just the yard and quiet and damp, the usual hum of the neighborhood. He let out a soft exhale. Okay, maybe I've been hitting the wine a little too hard lately, he muttered, before retreating back toward the couch. But even as he curled back up, his ears remained perked, listening for that hum again. As midnight neared, the Griffins drifted into uneasy rest. Peter snored loudly in the bedroom, tossing occasionally, his dreams fractured and strange. Lois lay beside him, eyes half open, as though her body resisted, surrendering fully to sleep. Meg's music had lulled her into a shallow doze, the glow of her headphones pulsing faintly in the dark. Chris, unsettled by his sketches, kept the lamp on, falling asleep with the pencil still clutched in his hand. Stewie, however, didn't sleep. He scribbled late into the night, diagrams and notes filling the pages with relentless detail, his tiny candle casting a dancing shadow on the wall behind him. And outside, above the Griffin home, the sky seemed unusually alive. The clouds shifted in unnatural swirls, lightning flashing faintly in the distance, though no thunder followed. It was as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath, waiting. Back in his restless dream, Peter found himself wandering an empty Quahog. The streets were silent, the shops abandoned, and even the clam stood with its doors wide open, but no laughter spilling out. He stumbled down the main road, calling out, "Hello? Anybody here?" But the only answer was his own echo bouncing back against hollow buildings. Then he saw it. A shadow at the far end of the street, not moving, just standing, watching. It had no face, no features, just a silhouette. Yet Peter felt his stomach twist with a fear he couldn't name. Lois? Quagmire? Chicken? His voice trembled slightly as he tried to fill the silence with humor. The figure didn't move, but the air seemed to pull tighter around him. and then, with a sudden flash of lightning, the figure was gone, leaving Peter staring at the emptiness with wide eyes. His body jolted awake. He sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. Lois stirred beside him, half asleep. "Peter? What's wrong?" He shook his head quickly, forcing a laugh. "Nothing, Lois. Just a bad dream. Probably ate too many Cheez-Its before bed again." But his voice betrayed him. The laughter thin and forced, the unease clinging like a shadow he couldn't shake. Lois reached for his hand gently. "Well, try to get some rest. Tomorrow's another day." She rolled over, drifting back toward sleep. Peter lay back down, staring at the ceiling. But sleep didn't come easily. The dream had felt too real, too heavy. And even though he told himself it was nothing deep down, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered otherwise. The memory of Brian's brush with moral temptation drifted into silence, like the last ripples in a pond after a stone has been thrown. It left behind a subtle stillness, a quiet recognition that beneath his charming exterior, the dog carried more shadows than he ever let on. But as is often the case in Quahog, life rarely gave him much time to dwell. The next morning, the rhythms of the Griffin household resumed as if nothing had happened. Chaotic and absurd, and yet strangely grounding for a dog who often felt untethered from the world. In the Griffin kitchen, Peter was making a scene over the lack of maple syrup. Lois was balancing a spatula in one hand and discipline in the other, and Meg was quietly slipping into her usual invisibility. Chris sat at the table, distracted by a drawing he was working on, and Stewie eyed him with the kind of curiosity that suggested schemes were already bubbling. Through all of this, Brian sat with his coffee, the steam curling into his face, as though inviting him to breathe in a small comfort. And yet behind his calm exterior, Brian's mind was elsewhere. For the better part of the morning, he kept thinking about his place in his family. They didn't treat him like a pet, at least not in the traditional sense. He had his own seat at the table, his own coffee mug, his own voice that carried weight in family debates. But there was always that small, gnawing question. Was he truly one of them, or was he still on the outside looking in? That question, subtle and ever-present, shaped the way he responded to the chaos around him. When Peter ranted about syrup conspiracies, or Lois sighed at the weight of her family's nonsense, Brian listened. He observed. He felt like both participant and spectator. And in those moments of strange clarity, Brian realized that his identity wasn't just tied to his intellectual musings, his romances, or even his vices. It was tied to the Griffins themselves. Without them, he wasn't sure he'd know who he was. Later that day, Brian found himself sitting with Stewie in the living room. The television was on, though neither of them paid much attention to the show flickering on the screen. Instead, Stewie was speaking in his usual mix of mockery and insight. "You know, Brian," he said with that sharp lilt, "for someone who insists on being seen as more than a pet, you do have a remarkable talent for acting like one. You sit, you sip, you stare into space. Very profound." Brian chuckled dryly. "Thanks, Stewie. I'll add that to my resume." But beneath the banter, there was weight. Stewie's words, intentionally or not, poked at the very insecurity Brian carried with him. He wasn't quite human, but he wasn't quite animal either. He was caught in a liminal space, and that in-between state could feel suffocating. As the afternoon gave way to evening, Brian took a walk through the neighborhood, something he did whenever his thoughts became too loud to ignore. Quahog wasn't exactly picturesque, but there was something comforting about its ordinary streets, its imperfect houses, its blend of absurdity and routine. He padded along the sidewalks, his paws dampened by patches of dew, and let his mind wander. It was during this walk that he stumbled into another memory, a different kind of memory, one tinged not with moral failure or embarrassment, but with something closer to tenderness. He remembered the first time he truly realized that the Griffins saw him as family. It had been years ago, one of those moments that might have seemed small to anyone else but left an imprint on him. He had been injured, nothing too serious, but enough to leave him limping for a few days. And instead of brushing it off or treating him like a dog with a sprained paw, Lois fussed over him. She made him comfortable, checked on him constantly, and even Peter, clumsy, oblivious Peter, brought him snacks and sat beside him while watching television. It was the kind of care you gave to family, not just to a pet. That moment stayed with Brian, and as he walked now, he felt it rise up like a reminder. No matter how uncertain he felt about his place in the world, with the Griffins, he had a home. Still, even that comfort came with complications. The Griffins weren't a perfect family. In fact, they were often messy, dysfunctional, and sometimes outright destructive. Loving them meant tolerating their flaws, and being loved by them meant enduring their chaos. For Brian, it was both grounding and disorienting. He needed them, but sometimes he wasn't sure they needed him. When he returned home that evening, the house was quiet. Peter had fallen asleep in the recliner, mouth open, a faint snore filling the room. Chris had gone upstairs. Meg was likely lost in her own corner of invisibility, and Lois was still cleaning up the remnants of dinner. Stewie, however, sat awake, almost waiting for him. "You're back," Stewie said simply, his eyes flicking up from the toy he had been tinkering with. "Yeah," Brian replied, settling onto the couch. For a moment there was silence between them, the kind of silence that felt almost like a conversation in itself. It wasn't often that Brian felt truly seen, but Stewie, strange, brilliant, menacing little Stewie, had a way of seeing through him. "You know," Stewie said after a pause, "the irony of your life is almost poetic. You want so badly to be human, but it's your flaws, your contradictions, that make you the most human of all." Brian smiled faintly, not sure if it was a compliment or an insult. That almost sounded like wisdom. "Don't get used to it," Stewie replied with a smirk, though his tone carried a weight beyond the sarcasm. That night, as Brian lay in his bed, he thought about those words. He thought about his place in the family, his contradictions, his need to belong. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was filled with dreams, not of grandeur or romance, but of something simpler, a dinner table, a cup of coffee, the sound of laughter. It wasn't perfection, it wasn't clarity, but it was home. The next day began, as most days did, with noise. Peter was shouting about some nonsense. Lois was trying to rein things in, and Stewie was already plotting something sinister. But in the middle of it all, Brian felt something shift. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable, an acceptance, however fleeting, that maybe he didn't need to figure it all out. Maybe being in between wasn't a curse. It was just who he was. And with that small realization, Brian carried himself differently. His conversations were laced with a bit more ease, his observations tinged with a softer edge. The contradictions didn't vanish, but they didn't weigh him down as heavily. In the late afternoon, Brian once again found himself outside, this time not wandering aimlessly, but walking with a quiet purpose. He knew he would never fully resolve the questions about his identity, his belonging, or his contradictions. But perhaps resolution wasn't the point. Perhaps the point was simply to live it, to embody the in-between, to exist in the liminal, to find meaning, not in answers, but in the act of searching. As he reached the park, he sat beneath a tree and watched as families passed by. Parents with children, teenagers with friends, elderly couples walking hand in hand. Each of them seemed to belong in their own way, and in observing them, Brian felt less like an outsider and more like someone who was part of the tapestry, even if his thread looked a little different. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the park in hues of gold and amber, and in that fading light, Brian felt something he hadn't felt in a long while. Peace. Not complete, not permanent, but enough. As the quiet rhythm of the Griffin household moved onward, the subtle shift of focus within Chris's story revealed not just the humor that often surrounded him, but the hidden vulnerabilities that made him far more layered than most would assume. His awkwardness, so often the subject of a joke, became a kind of fragile shield, an armor that cracked in unexpected moments, revealing the heart of someone who longed for validation, for recognition, and perhaps, above all, for acceptance. The walls of the Griffin house had seen countless stories unfold, and in those walls lay the narrative of a boy suspended between childhood and maturity, too clumsy to be graceful, yet too thoughtful to ever be written off entirely. When we peel back the layers of Chris's life, we see the way his role as the middle child sits heavily upon him. He is not the brilliant baby plotting with sophistication, nor is he the often overlooked Meg whose struggles for belonging take a different form. Instead, Chris is placed in the hazy in-between, neither the center of attention nor the complete outcast. This peculiar position gives him freedom at times, yet it also leaves him vulnerable to being dismissed or underestimated. His identity, his sense of self, is constantly shifting, quietly tested by the forces around him, and it's here that the deeper themes of his lore quietly grow. There's a certain beauty in the way Chris lingers at the periphery of the narrative, stepping forward only when circumstance demands it. His simplicity is not just naivety, it is sometimes clarity, an outlook untainted by the sharper edges of cynicism that shape his family. And yet even that innocence becomes a double-edged sword, because it exposes him to ridicule, misunderstanding, and the kind of invisibility that eats away at self-worth. But therein lies the fascinating paradox. Chris's invisibility is precisely what makes his lore so potent. In the silences between his appearances, he carries the weight of possibilities, of what-ifs, of the narrative space left for us to imagine who he truly is beneath the bumbling exterior. We notice this especially in the way Chris navigates relationships beyond his immediate family. His attempts at friendship often mirror his attempts at art, messy, sometimes misguided, but bursting with sincerity. There are times when his genuine nature connects with others in surprising ways, moments where his lack of guile makes him oddly magnetic. In those moments, Chris stops being the background character and becomes, even if briefly, the soul of the room, the one whose unfiltered honesty shines through. Yet just as quickly, the world around him seems to pull him back into his designated role as comic relief, reminding him and us of the fragile balance he is caught within. The threads of his identity tie themselves closely to creativity. His art, often ridiculed for its crude style, becomes a metaphor for how he sees himself, misunderstood, overlooked, yet deeply personal. For Chris, drawing isn't simply about expression. It's about carving a space where his voice cannot be mocked, a world he controls when the real one feels far too unstable. And if we think about it long enough, we see that his sketches, no matter how clumsy, hold a kind of quiet defiance. Each line on paper whispers, "I exist. I matter." This need for validation, this yearning to be recognized for who he truly is, shapes much of his hidden lore. But what happens when that validation is absent? What happens when Chris constantly caught between recognition and dismissal, retreats further into himself. Here lies the haunting undertone of his narrative, the possibility of being forgotten not just by his family, but by the story itself. And yet, paradoxically, it is this very danger that makes his presence linger in the audience's memory. For while the show often leans on Chris for humor or absurdity, the subtext of his character, his vulnerability, his potential, his uncertainty, remains long after the laughter fades. The tension between who Chris is and who he wants to be quietly shapes his interactions with his father, Peter. Peter, often brash and oblivious, embodies the chaotic, exaggerated traits of adulthood, while Chris represents the raw uncertainty of adolescence. Their relationship is one of reflection and distortion. Chris sees in Peter both what he might become and what he fears to inherit. The comedy between them often veils a deeper undertone, Chris trying to navigate the path between emulating and escaping his father's shadow. The weight of this duality cannot be understated, because in Peter's reckless confidence, Chris finds both aspiration and caution, a reminder of the blurred line between foolishness and freedom. It's also worth exploring the subtle role Lois plays in shaping Chris's identity. Her maternal guidance, though often fraught with her own flaws, creates moments of grounding for Chris. Yet her expectations sometimes hover just beyond his reach, creating in him a quiet sense of inadequacy. The interplay between Lois's structured authority and Peter's chaotic influence leaves Chris suspended in a tug-of-war, unsure of which example to follow, and often retreating to his own world of imagination as a way to cope. Beyond family, however, lies the most delicate part of Chris's lore, the struggle with himself. Adolescence, with all its contradictions, becomes his battlefield. In his laughter, we hear echoes of insecurity. In his stillness, we glimpse longing. In his mistakes, we find the very essence of growing up, clumsy, imperfect, and often misunderstood. His story is not about grand victories or dramatic arcs, but about the subtler moments where self-acceptance feels just out of reach, where the weight of invisibility presses against him, and yet somehow he continues to endure. The narrative of Chris Griffin is one that thrives in the spaces between humor and vulnerability. He is the quiet reminder that not every story is told loudly, not every character demands the spotlight, and not every arc is defined by grand resolutions. Sometimes the most enduring lore lies in the subtler, quieter places, within the awkward silences, the unnoticed glances, the crude sketches pinned to the wall of a bedroom where a boy, too easily forgotten, continues to dream of being seen. And as we settle further into his story and the realization deepens, Chris's lore is not about perfection. It is about presence. It is about the strange, tender resilience of someone who stumbles again and again, and yet never disappears completely. In his very imperfection, he becomes one of the most profoundly human characters in the Griffin household, an anchor of sincerity in a world that so often drifts toward absurdity. As we drift with him through the winding corridors of his identity, it becomes clear that Chris is far more than the comedic moments he is reduced to. He is instead a reflection of the quiet struggles we all carry, the desire to be recognized, the fear of being overlooked, and the hope that somewhere, somehow, who we are will matter. His story, often hidden beneath laughter, quietly insists that even the overlooked have their lore, even the forgotten hold a place in the greater tapestry. And it is here, in that fragile balance between visibility and presence, that Chris Griffin's truest story begins to unfold. The silence continues to stretch out like a lingering pause between scenes, a kind of invisible thread tying the fragments of Peter Griffin's journey together. One can almost hear the faint ticking of an unseen clock, a reminder that time, though often ignored in the looping world of Quahog, remains the quiet framework upon which Peter's story is drawn. Each tick seems to carry the weight of a moment, a laugh or a stumble, all drifting into the grand tapestry of his life. It is strange to consider that within the span of a single episode, Peter may live through chaos and absurdity so extreme it borders on the surreal. And yet by the time the credits roll, he always returns to the same living room, the same armchair, the same familiar family dynamic. This cyclical rhythm is both comforting and haunting. Comforting, because we know exactly where Peter will be when the lights come up again. Haunting, because it speaks to an endless loop. A man trapped in his own mythology, always circling back, never changing, never escaping. This cycle is what gives Peter his peculiar kind of immortality. He is unchanging, eternal, preserved in animation and memory. But within that immortality is a kind of tragic comedy. No matter how much chaos he unleashes, no matter how much meaning might glimmer in fleeting moments of clarity, Peter will always reset, as though the lessons never truly take hold. His character becomes a mirror, not of growth, but of the constant, repetitive nature of human folly. People, too, repeat mistakes, stumble into familiar patterns, and often laugh off their failures with bravado. Peter simply embodies that loop at its most exaggerated extreme. Beneath the layers of crude humor and slapstick violence lies the truth that Peter's mythology isn't about who he is, but about what he represents. He is a caricature of imperfection, an amplified reflection of human weaknesses. His selfishness mirrors impulses we all wrestle with. His laziness exaggerates our own tendency to avoid difficult responsibilities. His bursts of misplaced confidence reflect moments when we, too, overestimate our own wisdom. And yet Peter's story is wrapped in laughter, which makes it palatable, even endearing. It is easier to forgive Peter his flaws because we are laughing as he blunders through them. The strange irony is that within these exaggerations, the audience finds relief. By laughing at Peter, we confront our own chaos indirectly. His failures remind us of the absurdity of life, of the futility in expecting everything to make sense, of the comedy in even our darkest hours. When Peter loses his job, forgets his responsibilities, or embarrasses himself in public, we laugh because it is safer than mourning the reality that life is messy and unpredictable. In this way, Peter becomes a strange kind of release valve, a fool whose role is to absorb the collective absurdities we cannot bear to hold ourselves. But in between the gags and pratfalls, there are moments, brief, fragile moments, when Peter's humanity seeps through. A kind word to Lois, an unexpected bond with Chris, a fleeting recognition of Meg's struggles, or a strange, almost tender connection with Stewie. These are not common, nor are they always lasting, but they exist. And when they appear, they reveal the paradox of Peter Griffin, a man who is both absurd and real, selfish and caring, chaotic and deeply vulnerable. The rare glimpses of his softer side add depth to his mythology, reminding us that beneath the mask of the fool is still a person yearning for love, validation, and belonging. It is here in the contradictions that Peter becomes more than a mere sitcom character. He becomes mythic. Trickster figures in mythology are often agents of chaos, existing to destabilize order. to reveal hidden truths through mischief and to expose the fragile balance of the world. Peter embodies this role in Quahog. His blunders often bring disaster, but they also unearth truths. Lois's resilience, Stewie's complexity, Brian's cynicism, or even the town's collective absurdity. Through chaos, Peter illuminates the fabric of his world. Yet unlike many tricksters, Peter does not learn or grow from his mischief. He repeats endlessly, bound to his own comedic cycle. That eternal return, the joke that never ends, the laughter that never fades, becomes both his prison and his power. It ensures that he will always be familiar, always present, always ready to fall again. It is this timelessness that cements him not just as a character, but as a cultural symbol etched into the shared language of humor and satire. The mythology of Peter Griffin is not one of triumph or tragedy, but of endurance. He endures his own failures, his own foolishness, and in doing so, he endures in our imaginations. He is a reminder that perfection is unattainable, that chaos is unavoidable, and that sometimes the only sane response to life's absurdities is to laugh. As Chapter 3 winds to its close, the imagery grows quieter. Peter sits in his armchair, the glow of the television flickering across his face. He is unaware of the depth we have traced through his mythology, oblivious to the laughter that echoes beyond his own living room. To him, it is just another night, another channel, another joke. And perhaps that is fitting. The mythology does not belong to him. It belongs to us, the audience, who project meaning onto his endless antics, who find reflections of ourselves in his chaos. The laughter drifts softly now, fading into the stillness of the night. Peter remains, as he always will, unchanged yet unforgettable, a fool whose role is to remind us of the fragile balance between absurdity and meaning. The trickster sits quietly, waiting for the next cycle, the next fall, the next punchline. And so Chapter 3 rests, like the lull between two waves. The storm has not ended. It merely pauses. Ahead lies more. The tangled bonds of family, the strange relationships that define Peter's world, and the way his presence shapes everyone around him. These stories will unfold in their own time, stretching outward into the next arc of his lore. For now, we leave him in silence, a figure both laughable and profound, both timeless and fleeting. His mythology is not complete, it never will be. But it holds us long enough to carry us forward into the next chapter. The final image lingers. Peter Griffin, larger than life, yet still entirely human in his flaws. The laughter echoes, soft and fading, as the story turns its gaze toward what lies beyond. The spiral Peter had found himself tumbling through at the end of that long night was only the beginning of something far larger, something that reached into the very heart of his existence. As he lay awake in the quiet of his own house, the world outside felt like it was growing darker, pressing down on him. The rain that had come earlier still lingered in his ears, even though the skies had calmed. The shadows seemed longer, the walls seemed closer, and the silence was no longer silence at all. It was a canvas on which his thoughts painted their loudest and most unsettling shapes. This wasn't just guilt anymore, and it wasn't just the result of a few awkward reflections about how often he'd made a fool of himself. No, this was something deeper, something that was burrowing its way into his mind and forcing him to confront the idea that his entire existence was balancing on a delicate edge. Peter Griffin, the man who was always the punchline, always a walking disaster, always the one everyone expected to mess things up, was suddenly starting to wonder if there was anything more to him. And the scariest part was that he wasn't sure if he wanted there to be. You could imagine him lying in bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it creaked with every slow rotation. Lois was asleep beside him, her breathing steady, almost reassuring in its rhythm. But that reassurance didn't reach him anymore. Instead, it made the gulf inside him feel wider. How could she sleep so peacefully next to him? After all the chaos he had dragged her through. How could she rest her head each night while knowing the man beside her had stumbled from mistake to mistake, dragging his family with him? It wasn't self-pity. Not exactly. It was more like self-awareness, and for Peter Griffin, that was dangerous ground. He'd always survived by drowning out those thoughts with laughter, with noise, with distraction. But when the house grew quiet, the storm clouds in his head refused to fade. They whispered to him that his life was an endless cycle. He would blunder, he would cause damage, and his family would patch it back together. And then, before long, the pattern would start again. Was he doomed to keep spinning in circles until one day there was nothing left of him at all? The funny thing about Peter was that his missteps had always been played for laughs, at least to the outside world. The broken bones, the terrible ideas, the ridiculous schemes, the reckless bursts of violence or stupidity, they were all part of what made him Peter. But behind that laughter, there were fractures forming, tiny cracks in the mask that only widened as he stared into the silence of his own house. What if, deep down, he wasn't just a clown, but a tragedy waiting to collapse? It was in moments like this that the house itself seemed to turn against him. The stairs creaked like old bones. The floorboards sighed beneath the weight of his guilt. Even the pictures on the walls, frozen smiles from birthdays, Christmases, and family trips, felt like they were staring back at him, demanding an answer he didn't have. Was this the man they had immortalized in those photographs? Was this the man who was supposed to carry the Griffin family forward? He thought of Meg then, of how often he had failed her. He thought of Chris, still so unsure of himself, fumbling through adolescence without a guide. He thought of Stewie, brilliant but damaged, already carrying scars from a father who wasn't there in the way he should have been. And of course, Lois, always strong, always forgiving, always holding the family together while Peter unraveled piece by piece. The weight of all of that pressed down on him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt genuinely afraid. Afraid not of dying, not of some silly accident, or some reckless decision catching up to him, but afraid of being forgotten. Afraid that when his story was over, it would be told only as a joke with no deeper meaning, no love, no redemption. And that fear was the seed that grew into obsession. Peter began to wonder if his whole life was leading to something darker, something he couldn't name but could feel looming just out of reach. Every mistake, every reckless laugh, every moment of chaos, it all seemed to be pointing him toward a destiny he didn't understand. And the more he thought about it, the more he began to feel like he was being watched. Not just by his family or by the neighbors, but by something bigger. Something that saw him not as a man, but as a piece in a much larger story. That's when he started seeing shadows where there shouldn't have been any. The corners of the house would flicker in ways his eyes couldn't explain. Shapes seemed to move against the wall when no one else was awake. And at times, when the silence grew too heavy, Peter swore he heard his name being whispered, dragged across the air like an echo from another world. At first, he laughed it off because of course he did. That was his nature. He would joke, he would dismiss it. He would pretend it didn't matter. But deep down, the laughter wasn't real anymore. Deep down, he knew there was something there, something tied to him, something that was waiting. And the most haunting part of all was the thought that maybe this was his punishment. Maybe his years of selfishness and failure were finally catching up with him. Maybe he was supposed to see these shadows, to hear these whispers, to feel the weight of something pressing down on him from the other side. It wasn't just paranoia, it was penance. The nights dragged on longer and longer. Sleep became harder to reach. He would stare at the ceiling until the sun rose, and even then, the heaviness never left him. The others didn't notice, at least not at first. They assumed Peter was just being Peter, dozing off at the table, zoning out during conversations, mumbling to himself when he thought no one was listening. But Lois began to see it. She noticed the way his eyes lingered on the shadows a little too long. She noticed how he flinched when thunder cracked outside. And most of all, she noticed how he was quieter now, almost as if he was listening for something she couldn't hear. For Peter, this was no longer just about guilt. It was about survival. He felt like he was on the edge of something monumental, something terrifying, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep it buried. His story wasn't just a cycle anymore. It was becoming a countdown. And as that realization grew sharper, the house itself seemed to sink deeper into silence, almost waiting for Peter, despite his goofy nature, had stumbled onto something deeper within himself, and that was the notion of purpose. In many ways, Peter Griffin had always been drifting through life, moving from one absurd antic to the next without much thought. He'd find himself at the bar with his friends, at the dinner table, and with his family, or stuck in a bizarre scheme that usually ended with chaos. But in those rare reflective moments like this, he started to think about why he did the things he did, and whether any of it mattered in the larger scope of his life. Of course, with Peter, these reflections never lasted long before being overshadowed by another impulsive thought. Still, it was in these fleeting glimpses that the viewer could sense something beneath the surface of Quahog's biggest buffoon. The next morning, the sunlight filtered through the blinds of the Griffin household. Lois, as usual, was up early, managing the rhythm of the family, while Peter lay sprawled across the bed, snoring in that loud, rumbling way that seemed to shake the walls. The previous night's introspection was gone, replaced by the careless, childlike energy that defined him most days. He stumbled downstairs, scratching his belly, greeted by the usual chaos of Meg begging for some semblance of attention, Chris trying to figure out breakfast without burning down the kitchen, and Stewie plodding quietly in the corner, his expression unreadable, but always calculating. Lois turned to him with that familiar, exasperated tone. "Peter, could you, for once, try to help with the kids instead of barging in and making more of a mess?" Her words were firm, but not unkind. She had grown used to managing Peter's reckless tendencies, balancing her frustration with a deep, if complicated, love for her husband. Peter, half listening, responded with something absurd about how breakfast should include nachos and beer. The room filled with groans, but in typical Family Guy fashion, his antics diffused the tension, redirecting the focus back to the oddball humor that surrounded him. Yet behind the jokes, there was still the subtle thread of family connection. The way Lois sighed and smiled anyway, the way the kids rolled their eyes but stayed grounded by his presence. Later that day, Peter found himself at the Drunken Clam, sitting with Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe. The group's conversations often drifted toward crude jokes, exaggerated stories, or nostalgic retellings of past disasters. But on this particular afternoon, Peter was quieter than usual, sipping his beer and staring at the bubbles rising to the surface. Joe noticed it first, tilting his head with curiosity. "Peter," you're awfully quiet today. Usually by now you've suggested we try some idiotic stunt that'll get us all in trouble." Peter shrugged. "I don't know, Joe. I've been thinking. Like, what if there's more to life than all the dumb stuff we do? What if I'm supposed to be something else? Like, not just some guy who eats way too many burgers and messes things up all the time?" Quagmire chuckled. Giggity. "Peter, you're not exactly cut out to be a philosopher. But hey, everyone's got their thing. Maybe your thing is just being you." Cleveland added, "You know, sometimes being you is more than enough. People don't need you to be perfect. They just need you to be there." This moment, light as it was, reinforced one of the undercurrents of Family Guy storytelling, that amidst the chaos and absurdity, there was always a tether back to relationships, to the way people leaned on each other, even in the strangest of circumstances. Peter wasn't a wise man, nor was he a hero, but he was a father, a husband, and a friend. That in itself carried weight. The show often danced along that fine line between parody and poignancy. Viewers might laugh at Peter's ridiculous missteps, but then find themselves caught off guard by a scene where he holds Meg's hand after a bad day, or where he admits to Lois that he doesn't always know what he's doing, but he tries in his own clumsy way because he loves them. Those rare glimpses are what Chapter 4 leans into. The duality of Peter Griffin, the jester who sometimes reveals the heart of the story. That night, as the storm clouds rolled over Quahog, Peter sat outside in the yard, a beer in hand, looking up at the sky. The flashes of lightning reflected in his eyes as the rain began to fall lightly, dotting his shirt and rolling down his cheeks. Lois opened the back door, stepping into the rain to stand beside him. She didn't scold him for sitting in the storm, nor did she nag him to come inside. Instead, she simply placed a hand on his shoulder. "You think too much sometimes, Peter," she said softly, her voice carrying through the patter of the rain. "But that's not a bad thing. Just don't lose yourself trying to be something you're not." Peter nodded, his usual grin tempered by a rare moment of seriousness. "Yeah, Lois. I guess I just don't want the kids to look back one day and think their dad was just some idiot who wasted his life." Lois squeezed his shoulder. "They won't. Because no matter what crazy thing you do, they'll always remember that you were there. You're not perfect, Peter. None of us are. But you're theirs, and that's enough." The scene might have seemed unusually tender for Peter, but it fit into the greater arc, showing how the show's absurdity could coexist with these quieter beats of humanity. The storm rumbled on, the house behind them glowing warmly through the windows, a symbol of the chaos and comfort that defined the Griffin family. Inside, Stewie watched them from the living room, his little face pressed against the glass. For once, there was no elaborate plan brewing in his mind. Instead, he observed silently, processing the strange mixture of love and absurdity that held his family together. Chris wandered in, holding a sandwich, and stood beside his younger brother. "What you looking at?" Chris asked, his voice muffled by a bite of bread. Stewie didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned, his usual smirk softening. "Just life, I suppose." The humor of the moment was clear. Stewie, the baby genius with world domination schemes, speaking like an old soul while his brother stood there munching without a care in the world. Yet the juxtaposition captured exactly what this chapter aimed to highlight: the Griffin family's balance of chaos and unexpected heart. As the night wore on, the rain slowed, the lightning faded, and the storm passed. Peter and Lois returned inside, dripping wet, but sharing a laugh that lightened the room. The family gathered together for one of those rare evenings where no wild scheme threatened to tear things apart. It was just them in their flawed, bizarre, yet deeply connected way. And it's in this dynamic that the essence of Family Guy shines, not in the gags or the outrageous cutaways, but in the moments where the humor serves as a backdrop for the relationships that keep the Griffins grounded. Peter stood in silence for a moment, the faint echo of the Grim Reaper's lingering presence still scratching at the edges of his mind. The house was quiet, though in Quahog quiet never stayed for long. A clatter from the kitchen broke the stillness, probably Lois preparing something for the kids, or Brian pouring himself another drink. But for Peter, it was like a jolt back into reality. He blinked, rubbed his face, and muttered almost to himself, "You know, sometimes I feel like life's just one long commercial break where the show never comes back on." It was half a joke, half a sigh, but it captured the strange cocktail of dread and humor that seemed to define him at this stage of the story. The weight of mortality hadn't left him. It never did. It wasn't like flipping a channel where you could turn off one program and dive into another. This lingering anxiety and this awareness of an eventual end traveled with Peter like a shadow that stretched through the streets of Quahog and followed him back home. Yet what made Peter, well, Peter, was the way he balanced this existential dread with the utterly ridiculous. For every thought about death, he had 3 thoughts about whether Pawtucket Patriot Ale could sponsor a Grim Reaper happy hour, or if maybe death could be bribed with a coupon for free wings at the Drunken Clam. Still, the kitchen noises pulled him forward. As he wandered in, Lois turned from the counter, eyebrows raised, as if she sensed something unusual about his demeanor. "Peter," she said gently, "you look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse," Peter replied with an exaggerated shudder. "I've seen death again. And not just like when Meg's cooking smells like chemicals, and I think I'm dying. No, like real death. You know, black robe, bony fingers, bad bedside manner." Lois shook her head with that blend of exasperation and patience she reserved only for him. "Peter, we've all met death before. He's practically part of this family by now. You can't let it rattle you every time." Peter plopped himself at the table and muttered, "Easy for you to say. You don't got to worry about what kind of embarrassing thing they're going to put on your tombstone. Knowing Quahog, mine's probably just going to say, Peter Griffin. He farted too loud." Brian, padding into the kitchen with a glass of scotch in hand, quipped dryly, "Honestly, that's not too far off the mark." The tension cracked, but only slightly. The humor was there, the absurdity of Peter's outlook was intact, yet something in the undercurrent remained darker. It was as if Peter's mind had begun to catalog every close call, every brush with catastrophe, every ridiculous moment where his mortality had hung by a thread. It was easy to laugh about death when it showed up in cartoonish form. But now, in the soft morning light of his kitchen, Peter's fear felt heavier, less dismissible. To lighten his own mood, Peter decided to distract himself. "You know what I need," he declared suddenly. "A road trip. That's what fixes everything. Nothing like driving around, singing songs, maybe crashing into a parade or two. Road trip." Lois groaned. "Peter, we don't need another one of your half-baked ideas. Remember what happened last time you said you wanted a road trip? We ended up in a swamp with Joe's wheelchair stuck in the mud, while Quagmire got chased by a goose." "That goose had a vendetta," Peter shot back, wagging a finger in the air, as if he were making a courtroom argument. "You don't just walk away from a goose fight. That's like turning your back on the mafia." But Lois's reminder didn't stop him. In fact, it only fueled him. Within hours, Peter had gathered the guys, announcing to Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe that they were going to hit the open road and, in Peter's words, find out if life has meaning, or at least find a good Taco Bell that doesn't get my order wrong. The next scene unfolded with the 4 men piled into Peter's car, their banter spilling out in that familiar rhythm. Quagmire cracked jokes about roadside motels. Joe tried to maintain some semblance of order. Cleveland chimed in with his slow drawl. And Peter, of course, was driving like a man who thought traffic laws were just polite suggestions. Yet beneath the humor, the theme carried forward. Mortality on the road. Every sharp turn felt like a gamble. Every close call a reminder that Peter was, in fact, fragile. The absurd scenarios, narrowly avoiding a truck full of chickens, accidentally driving into a funeral procession, stopping at a gas station, where the attendant suspiciously resembled death, were all coated in humor, but for Peter, each moment pressed on the lingering thought that time wasn't endless. At one point, Joe broke through the chatter. "Peter, what's with you lately? You're acting like every pothole is a death sentence." Peter gripped the wheel tightly. "Because, Joe, every pothole is a death sentence if you think about it. What if the tire blows out, huh? What if we flip over and then it's all over? Do you want that written on my tombstone? Here lies Peter Griffin, victim of a pothole." Quagmire leaned forward from the back seat with a smirk. "Giggity. I'd visit that tombstone." The car erupted in laughter, but Peter's grip didn't loosen. In a strange way, this trip was his attempt at both confronting and escaping his fear. By diving into chaos, by putting himself in absurd danger, he was trying to normalize it. If he could laugh at death on the road, maybe he could laugh at death when it really came. The road trip became a series of misadventures, each one framed by the absurd humor of Family Guy, but underlined with Peter's growing unease. They stopped at a diner where the waitress wore a skull pendant that made Peter choke on his pancakes. They checked into a motel where the "Do Not Disturb" sign was a picture of a skeleton. They even passed a billboard for funeral services that read, "Your last road trip starts here." Each encounter was cartoonishly over the top, yet it felt to Peter like the universe itself was taunting him, reminding him that he couldn't run from mortality, no matter how many distractions he stacked in front of himself. Eventually, after a long day of misadventures, the guys sat around a campfire they'd built just off the road. The night sky stretched above them, stars scattered across the black canvas, and for a moment, silence settled. Peter looked up, his voice quieter now. "You ever think, maybe all this is just a practice run? Like we're just one bad decision away from the credits rolling. And we don't even know what kind of music they'll play over our credits." Brian, who had tagged along despite pretending earlier that he wasn't interested, took a sip of his drink and said, "Peter, that's called being human. Everyone feels that way sooner or later. The trick is not letting it consume you. Otherwise, you stop living before you're dead." Peter nodded slowly. His eyes reflected the firelight, caught between fear and understanding. He wasn't ready to embrace it yet, but the thought lingered. Maybe the fear of death was just another reminder to live louder, to laugh harder, to make the absurd count. The flames crackled, the guys chuckled at Quagmire's latest inappropriate joke, and Peter leaned back, staring at the stars. For the first time in a while, the weight felt lighter, not gone, but shared among friends, burned away a little by the absurd firelight of Family Guy's strange, tender chaos. Chris's mind spun like a carousel, each thought flashing brightly before being swallowed by the next. His identity, his weight, his purpose. These questions weren't just philosophical musings. For Chris, they were constant companions, gnawing at his sense of self-worth. And yet there was also resilience buried deep within him, a stubborn core that refused to be crushed completely. Sometimes it appeared when he drew in his sketchbook, sometimes when he built strange but inventive contraptions, and other times when he surprised everyone with insight hidden beneath his bumbling exterior. These sparks hinted at someone still forming, still struggling to break free from the mold others had cast him into. That's where the beauty and tragedy of Chris Griffin lies. Unlike Stewie, whose genius bursts through in dramatic plots, or Meg, whose suffering is loud in its neglect, Chris's lore is quieter, more subdued, but no less profound. His story is about the boy who always seems to fall behind, who lingers in the shadows of stronger personalities, yet whose humanity, clumsy, awkward, but undeniably sincere, remains steady. In exploring his adolescence, Family Guy almost teases us with glimpses of what could have been if Chris had been taken more seriously. When he finds himself drawn into art, we see in his paintings a raw, unfiltered truth that others overlook. His talent isn't refined, but it speaks with honesty. He sketches what he sees, how he feels, and sometimes, though the show buries it beneath humor, his drawings whisper of someone desperate to be understood. They are windows into a heart that rarely gets to speak out loud. And in those moments, we remember that Chris is, in many ways, the most human of the Griffins. His flaws aren't exaggerated to surreal extremes. They are familiar. His overeating, his lack of confidence, his awkward interactions with the world. They are reflections of real adolescent struggles, albeit wrapped in cartoon absurdity. But the show doesn't always linger there. Instead, it often chooses to use Chris as the punchline. He becomes the awkward teenager who doesn't understand subtlety, who blurts out the wrong thing, who stumbles where others stride. Yet beneath that, there's a lore worth tracing, because Family Guy, almost inadvertently, shows us that Chris is the silent survivor. He absorbs the chaos of his family without entirely crumbling. Even when mocked, even when overlooked, he continues. That persistence is quiet but powerful. It gives him a strange resilience, the kind of endurance that may not win battles, but certainly outlasts storms. Chris's friendships also add depth to this picture. He doesn't have many friends, and often he's the outsider among his peers. But in the rare instances where he forms bonds, like with Neil Goldman or other quirky classmates, there's sincerity in how he clings to connection. He doesn't approach friendships with calculation or pretense. Instead, he approaches them with openness, however awkward. In this way, Chris embodies something simple yet profound, a desire for belonging, even when the world doesn't quite make space for him. There's also an innocence in Chris that stands out against the darker or more cynical tones of Family Guy. Where Stewie plots domination and Peter stumbles into reckless immorality, Chris often engages with the world with a kind of unguarded earnestness. He believes in things. He gets scared easily. He trusts quickly. And while that makes him the butt of jokes, it also frames him as the Griffin who still carries untainted humanity. He hasn't been completely warped by the world's cruelty. Not yet. But of course, the show can't resist pulling him into strange, darker corners. Episodes that explore Chris's sexuality or his encounters with disturbing figures like Herbert the Pervert twist his innocence into something unsettling. These storylines highlight the tension at the core of his lore. Chris is caught between childhood and adulthood, often placed in situations where he doesn't fully grasp the danger or strangeness around him. And that confusion, that vulnerability, paints a haunting picture of adolescence itself, messy, unpredictable, and often uncomfortable. In many ways, Chris represents the fragility of growing up. He's not as hardened as Peter, not as manipulative as Stewie, not as resigned as Meg. He is still in the process of becoming, still caught in the middle. And that liminality makes his story compelling. His failures and his awkwardness are easy to laugh at, but they're also easy to empathize with. Because who hasn't stumbled through moments of adolescence feeling lost, uncertain, and out of place? Take his relationship with Peter, for example. It's one of the most complex dynamics in the family. Peter often oscillates between neglecting Chris and trying to bond with him in misguided ways. Sometimes he's the absent father, treating Chris as an afterthought. Other times he tries to mold Chris into a version of himself, pulling him into reckless schemes or absurd lessons about manhood. And through it all, Chris simply yearns for approval. He wants Peter to see him, to guide him, to acknowledge him. Not just as a punchline, but as a son. And this yearning often goes unanswered, leaving Chris in a strange emotional limbo. He respects his father, but doesn't always understand him. He loves him, but often finds himself let down. And in that space, Chris mirrors the experience of many children growing up under parents who are flawed, distracted, or incapable of offering the guidance they crave. When Chris does rebel, it's usually quiet, short-lived, or accidental. Unlike Meg, whose defiance occasionally bursts through, or Stewie, whose rebellion is calculated, Chris's resistance is clumsy and half-formed. He might stomp his feet or try to assert himself, but his protests usually fizzle out. This isn't weakness, it's realism. Because sometimes adolescence doesn't look like dramatic rebellion. Sometimes it looks like quiet frustration, bottled up until it fades. And then there are moments when Chris surprises us. He'll say something unexpectedly insightful, or demonstrate an unusual skill, or reveal a depth that his family never expected. These flashes remind us that beneath the awkward exterior, Chris has layers. He isn't just the goofy, overweight teenager. He's a young man searching for identity, stumbling forward in the shadow of louder voices. As Family Guy continues, the lore of Chris Griffin doesn't build in a neat arc. It's scattered, fragmented, sprinkled across episodes. But when we piece these fragments together, we see a portrait of adolescence in all its awkward glory. Hopeful yet insecure. Yearning yet uncertain. Clumsy yet sincere. And in that portrait, Chris stands as an oddly relatable figure. He doesn't shine with brilliance like Stewie, nor does he command sympathy like Meg. But he endures. He laughs, he stumbles, he gets back up, and he continues. And maybe that is the quiet message of Chris Griffin's lore, that survival in itself is a story worth telling. Because when we strip away the absurdity, when we peel back the layers of comedy, what remains is this simple truth. Chris is a boy trying to grow up in a family that doesn't always make space for him. He is awkward, overlooked, sometimes humiliated, but he remains. And in that persistence, in that awkward resilience, we find a strange kind of strength. And so, as Chapter 4 continues to unfold, we'll trace Chris's lore further, through the shadows of adolescence, through the strange encounters that shaped him, and through the fragile, yet enduring humanity that makes him one of Family Guy's quietest, but most resonant characters. As we move forward from the somber reflections of Meg's disillusionments, we find ourselves once again facing the persistent truth that Family Guy never allows its characters to simply remain within their struggles. Instead, it pushes them, sometimes cruelly, sometimes comically, into situations where their vulnerabilities are exposed in ways that are both darkly humorous and oddly cathartic. Meg, more than almost anyone else in the Griffin household, is caught in a cycle of rejection and resilience, a pendulum that swings between hope and heartbreak, comedy and tragedy. And it is this very cycle that defines the core of her deeper lore. Because if Chapter 3 gave us an intimate view into the shadows of Meg's emotional state, And segment 2 pulled us further into the contradictions of her social identity. Then chapter 4 begins to unravel the hidden patterns that repeat in her life. Patterns of being silenced, minimized, and humiliated, yet still re-emerging in ways that show her quiet endurance. And so, as we wrap up this chapter, we begin to see how Meg's story embodies not just a recurring gag in an animated sitcom, but a deeper reflection of alienation, survival, and the bitter comedy of being unseen. Meg Griffin is a character whose arc, if you trace it through seasons, feels like a constant stifling of her voice. When she tries to assert herself, her family dismisses her. When she finds moments of pride, they are interrupted or ridiculed. When she seeks connection, she is abandoned. These are not simply one-off jokes. They are structural elements of her existence in the series. And while audiences laugh at the repetition of these humiliations, there's also a deeper resonance. Meg becomes a mirror for how society often treats those it deems unworthy of attention. She becomes a reminder of how easy it is to overlook the pain of others when their suffering is played for amusement. Take, for instance, the countless times Meg is ignored when she tries to share something meaningful. Whether it's a story about her day, a small achievement at school, or even a warning about danger, the family either talks over her or redirects the conversation elsewhere. These scenes are played for laughs, but their consistency creates a pattern of exclusion that feels hauntingly familiar. How many people in the real world, especially teenagers, feel invisible at the dinner table, unheard in classrooms, unseen in social circles? Through Meg, the writers tap into this silent ache, then push it to absurd extremes, transforming invisibility into a running motif of humiliation. And yet, even within this bleak cycle, there are moments where Meg refuses to disappear. These are not grand victories or heroic redemptions, but small flashes of defiance, scenes where she either lashes back with anger or asserts her worth in ways that are surprisingly raw for a show built on sarcasm and absurdity. One of the most striking examples comes in the infamous scene where Meg, after years of mistreatment, finally confronts her family at the dinner table. In that moment, she pours out years of resentment, articulating the pain of being the family scapegoat. And while the show ultimately twists the scene back into comedy, for that fleeting moment, Meg becomes more than a joke. She becomes a voice of truth within the chaos of the Griffin household. It's a rare glimpse into what could have been had this series chosen to explore Meg's character more deeply. But perhaps it's precisely because such moments are rare that they stand out so powerfully. They feel like ruptures in the comedy, cracks in the fourth wall where the character almost speaks directly to the audience. Meg's pain, usually trivialized, suddenly becomes undeniable, and in those moments the lore of her character deepens. She is no longer just a vessel for a mockery, but a tragic emblem of neglect. And this is where the darker undertones of Family Guy's writing come into play. For in many ways, Meg represents the dangers of normalized cruelty. By constantly subjecting her to humiliation, the show forces us to confront the uneasy reality of how entertainment often thrives on someone's suffering. The audience is invited to laugh at Meg, but when you take a step back, the laughter becomes uneasy. What does it say about us as viewers that we find amusement in her repeated rejection? And what does it say about the Griffin family that their dysfunction finds its most concentrated expression in their treatment of her? Meg, in this sense, becomes the emotional punching bag, not just for her fictional family, but for the audience itself. She carries the weight of cruelty so that others can find humor in her pain. It's a disturbing dynamic, one that borders on psychological horror when viewed through a critical lens. Imagine being trapped in a world where every attempt at self-expression is silenced, every effort at belonging is ridiculed, and every glimpse of hope is quickly extinguished. That is Meg's world, and the brilliance or cruelty of Family Guy is that it frames this despair within the bright, colorful animation of a sitcom. And yet there is a resilience to Meg that cannot be ignored. Despite everything, she continues to exist within the family, to show up at the dinner table, to go to school, to endure the insults and invisibility. It is a quiet endurance, not glamorous or celebrated, but powerful in its own right. In many ways, Meg embodies the resilience of those who survive neglect, not by conquering it, but by simply enduring it. And this endurance, paradoxically, gives her a kind of strength that the rest of the Griffin family lacks. For Peter, Lois, Stewie, Brian, and even Chris often spin out of control in their own self-absorbed chaos. But Meg, despite her pain, maintains a strange sort of stability. She rarely causes the chaos, instead she absorbs it. She becomes the anchor, the one whose suffering grounds the family's dysfunction. It is an unenviable role, but it also gives her a peculiar kind of depth. Because while the others drown in their excesses, Meg's survival becomes an act of quiet defiance. And so, as we wrap up Chapter 4, we can begin to see Meg not merely as the overlooked Griffin child, but as a character who reveals something deeper about the entire series. She is both the butt of the joke and the bearer of truth. She is both the invisible figure at the table and the mirror reflecting the family's dysfunction. She is both tragedy and comedy, silence and defiance. This duality is what makes her lore so haunting. Because on the surface, Meg is easy to dismiss, just as her family dismisses her. But the more you look, the more you see that Meg holds together the fragile balance of the Griffin household. Without her, the family's cruelty would collapse in on itself. She is the container for their dysfunction, the silent witness to their chaos, the tragic figure whose endurance makes their absurdity possible. In this way, Meg becomes one of the most important characters in Family Guy, not because of what she does, but because of what she absorbs. And while her suffering may never be fully acknowledged within the show, her lore tells a different story. The story of endurance in the face of ridicule, resilience in the face of neglect, and the haunting truth that sometimes the strongest characters are the ones who suffer in silence. And so, as Chapter 4 closes, we leave Meg once again seated at the dinner table, half heard and half seen, her presence overshadowed by louder voices, yet still undeniably there, still enduring, still surviving, still holding together the fragile, dysfunctional world of the Griffins. Her story is not finished. It never truly is. For Meg's lore is not about resolution, it's about repetition. The cycle of neglect, humiliation, resilience, and silence will continue. But within that cycle lies the deepest, darkest truth of Family Guy, that behind the laughter, there is always someone suffering, always someone unseen. And Meg Griffin, more than anyone else, carries that truth, which is where our journey will lead us next, as Chapter 5 opens and we step deeper into the world, not of the family at large, but into the very soul of Meg's struggles, her twisted relationships, her hidden resilience, and the unspoken truths that the comedy refuses to acknowledge, but the lore cannot ignore. As Chapter 4 gently closed on the intertwining threads of Stewie's brilliance, Lois's lingering strength, and Peter's unpredictable absurdity, we find ourselves at the doorstep of the final chapter. The grand curtain call that ties together everything we've explored. Chapter 5 opens with a deliberate slowing of pace, the narration guiding us toward the core of the Griffin family's legacy. It is here where questions of belonging, identity, and purpose surface in ways that blend both heartfelt nostalgia and comedic reflection. The rhythm shifts from the scattered chaos of their individual journeys to the gravity of what it all means when brought together, when the spotlight is not only on one character, but on how they weave into a larger tapestry of Family Guy's lasting presence. The stage for Chapter 5 begins with Peter Griffin himself sprawled across the couch in that familiar quahog living room. The television flickers with static before abruptly switching to one of Peter's late-night favorites, some obscure infomercial that likely has no purpose other than luring him into impulsive purchases. Yet in this moment, Peter is less of a joke and more of a reflection of what Family Guy has always delivered, a man of contradiction, embodying the foolishness of irresponsibility and yet, strangely enough, the heart of the show's resilience. As the narrator pulls us in, Peter's laughter echoes faintly, not from one of his ridiculous cutaway gags, but from the sheer joy of existing within his chaos. That laughter, shallow though it may seem, is a thread connecting every absurd scenario we've followed. Whether it's him becoming a pirate, a superhero, or accidentally rewriting history, Peter has always been at the center, embodying both the freedom and the futility of a man-child navigating adulthood. This is where Chapter 5 begins, with Peter as the anchor of disorder and, paradoxically, the glue that keeps the story of Family Guy alive. From here, the lens widens to Lois, who walks into the room carrying laundry, her face carrying that familiar mix of exhaustion and quiet strength. She sets the basket down, glancing at Peter with the sort of look that only comes from decades of patience, part annoyance, part love, and part resignation. Lois's presence reminds us that Family Guy isn't merely about chaotic humor, but also about the balance of personalities, the way each member counteracts the other's extremes. Without Lois, Peter's world would collapse completely. Without Peter, Lois's resilience would have no testing ground. And so Chapter 5 asks, what does this dynamic mean in the greater lore of the show? If Peter represents chaos, Lois represents stability, then what emerges from the space between them? The answer, of course, is family. We then transition into a quiet evening scene. Brian sits by the fireplace, glass of wine in hand, speaking softly to himself in one of those existential musings that often land somewhere between profound and pathetic. His monologues, while humorous, underscore another thread of Family Guy's narrative fabric. The dog who thinks he's more than a pet, but is constantly humbled by life's indifference. In Chapter 5, Brian's voice becomes a grounding point, a reminder that every joke is shadowed by reflection. His search for identity, his failed romances, his intellectual pretensions, all of them echo the larger theme of trying to belong in a world that doesn't quite make sense. The scene drifts, almost like a dream, into Stewie's room. The youngest Griffin lies awake, eyes tracing the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to his ceiling. For a character once obsessed with domination and destruction, these small glowing stickers represent something fragile and human, hope. Stewie, more than anyone else, embodies the evolution of Family Guy's narrative. What began as a villainous caricature of an evil genius morphed into a deeply complex figure, a child yearning for identity, affection, and purpose. His room, quiet and dimly lit, becomes a symbolic space where the show's chaotic humor settles into something more poignant. This sequence forms the opening movement of Chapter 5. Each character framed not in isolation, but as part of the Griffin home, their individual arcs converging toward the same question. What is Family Guy's true legacy? Is it simply the gags and the outrageous humor? Or is it the unexpected way these caricatures of dysfunction reflect truths about real families, real struggles, and real longing? The narration gently draws us further, now inviting us into a reflection of how Family Guy has endured across decades. The show's irreverence, often controversial, has never been just about shock value. Instead, it is about testing the edges of humor while anchoring itself in familiar domestic spaces. Peter's idiocy works because Lois's patience balances it. Stewie's schemes matter because Brian is there to ground them with sarcasm or wisdom. Even Chris and Meg, often overshadowed, serve as reminders that family life is not about perfection, but about inclusion, even for those constantly ridiculed or overlooked. As we drift deeper into this first segment of Chapter 5, a narrative motif emerges. The Griffin household as both a circus and a sanctuary. The circus, the chaos, the absurdity, the unpredictable madness of cutaways and outlandish storylines. The sanctuary, the home, the family unit, the enduring space where love, though buried under jokes and dysfunction, somehow holds it all together. And here the voice slows, inviting the listener to imagine that house on Spooner Street at night. The lights are dimmed, the neighborhood quiet. Inside, the Griffins each occupy their own corners. Peter asleep on the couch, Lois quietly folding laundry in the kitchen, Stewie scribbling plans in his notebook, Brian sighing over another rejected manuscript, Meg tucked away in her room scrolling through her phone, Chris dreaming of simple pleasures. Individually, they are lost in their own worlds. Collectively, they form a picture of unity that is strangely comforting despite its flaws. This is the paradox Family Guy has always thrived on. A show defined by dysfunction that, when seen from the right angle, reflects the very essence of family itself. Not perfect, not polished, not even functional in the traditional sense, but enduring. A family that survives, laughs, and continues forward despite every absurd detour. And so, as segment 1 unfolds, the narrator begins weaving in the threads of the show's legacy. The final chapter is not just about recounting stories, but about understanding why these stories matter. It is about recognizing that behind every outrageous joke lies a subtle truth. That life is unpredictable, messy, and often ridiculous. Yet within that chaos, there is meaning. The final image of this portion lingers on the Griffin household at rest, the camera pulling back slowly as the house glows faintly against the night sky. The narration softens, offering a final reminder before we move deeper into the heart of Chapter 5. That in all its madness, Family Guy's enduring legacy is not just the laughter it sparks, but the strange comfort it offers. The reminder that no matter how absurd, how dysfunctional, or how bizarre life may seem, there is always a place called home. That's where the brilliance of Family Guy lies, not in presenting Peter as a flawless family man or a lovable buffoon who never truly changes, but in painting him as someone who exists in a gray zone between heart and havoc. And as the show moves into later seasons, Peter's behavior only becomes more exaggerated, more chaotic, and more unapologetically destructive. Yet somehow, the audience keeps following him. Not because he's an ideal role model, but because he mirrors the absurdity of human contradiction. Someone who can be cruel in one moment and deeply vulnerable in the next. As Peter's journey unfolds in the second half of his evolution, we start to see him drift into even stranger territories, almost as if the writers themselves leaned into his absurdity as a defining trait. For instance, in episodes where Peter takes on strange obsessions or outlandish hobbies, we're reminded of his addictive personality. He doesn't just get into a new interest casually. He throws himself into it with full force, often dragging his entire family along for the ride. Whether it's becoming overly obsessed with fishing, devoting himself to some bizarre new religion, or falling headfirst into a pop culture craze, Peter approaches these with an intensity that highlights both his gullibility and his endless appetite for distraction. But this isn't just a comedic device. It also speaks to something more profound about his character. Peter is always searching for excitement, searching for identity, searching for something that makes him feel important or validated. His need to latch onto new obsessions shows a restless spirit, someone who isn't entirely at ease in his own skin. And while this often leads to hilarious, disastrous consequences, it also shows us the hollowness that lingers beneath his loud exterior. One of the most striking examples of Peter's dual nature can be seen in his relationships outside his immediate family. While he's often seen as selfish and short-sighted, there are moments where he goes out of his way to protect his friends, especially Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire. Their dynamic is one of Peter's most consistent storylines. A group of middle-aged men sitting around cracking jokes, sharing beers, and dreaming of simpler days. Yet even within that camaraderie, Peter sometimes becomes the ringleader of chaos, pushing his friends into absurd situations they might not otherwise choose. And yet those friendships endure. Why? Because deep down, Peter has a kind of loyalty that outweighs his flaws. He might be reckless, he might be irresponsible, but he's also the guy who won't abandon his friends when things get tough. That theme of flawed loyalty is central to Peter's character. It shows us that while he's not always admirable, he is relatable. We all have moments where we fail the people we care about, but we also have moments where we surprise them with acts of loyalty they didn't expect. Moving deeper into Peter's arc, one thing that becomes increasingly clear is how much of his identity is wrapped up in his contradictions. He can be immature yet wise in fleeting moments. He can be selfish but capable of grand gestures of sacrifice. This makes him both unpredictable and strangely human. Family Guy doesn't try to resolve these contradictions. It revels in them. And that's part of the reason why Peter Griffin remains such a compelling character, even decades into the show. Think of the moments when Peter tries to connect with his children. With Chris, there are flashes of bonding that feel genuine, like when Peter tries to help him navigate adolescence, only to derail things with his own immaturity. With Meg, the relationship is notoriously toxic, but every now and then, Peter reveals a sliver of compassion, reminding us that even the cruelest parent-child dynamics can have complexity. And with Stewie, Peter often seems oblivious to his son's genius and malice, yet there are occasions where his simple-minded affection cuts through, giving us surprising moments of tenderness. Another layer to Peter's evolution is how he reacts to authority and social norms. He is, by nature, rebellious against structure. He doesn't like being told what to do, and he doesn't easily respect authority figures. Whether it's his boss at the brewery, a political figure, or even Lois's attempts to rein him in, Peter consistently pushes back. Sometimes this resistance is framed as stupidity, but at other times it becomes a satirical tool, using Peter's lack of respect to critique institutions, traditions, or societal expectations. For example, when Peter suddenly becomes a folk hero or a public figure in some bizarre twist of fate, his complete lack of self-awareness becomes a vehicle for the writers to poke fun at the absurdities of fame, politics, or American culture. And in those moments, Peter transforms from just a bumbling dad into a reflection of something much larger, a critique of the systems that surround us. Still, the heart of Peter's evolution lies in his relationship with Lois. She is, without question, his anchor. No matter how many times he screws up, no matter how often he lets his immaturity or selfishness take the wheel, Lois is there to ground him, or at least attempt to. Their relationship is far from perfect. In fact, it's often deeply flawed and at times disturbingly dysfunctional. But within that mess, there's an undeniable bond. Lois doesn't just tolerate Peter. She challenges him, she saves him, and in some ways, she completes him. Their love story is one of Family Guy's most enduring threads. Not because it's a fairy tale romance, but because it's messy, chaotic, and sometimes painful. It's real in its own exaggerated way. Lois sees the best and worst of Peter, and while she may despair at his antics, she also chooses him, again and again. And Peter, for all his flaws, truly loves Lois in return. That love may not always look healthy, but it's powerful, and it keeps the Griffin family orbiting around him, despite his constant missteps. By this stage of Peter's evolution, we can see that he's not meant to be admired in a straightforward way. He's not a role model. He's not even consistently likable. But he is endlessly fascinating. His contradictions, his impulsiveness, his flashes of vulnerability, and his surprising acts of loyalty all combine to make him a character who defies easy categorization. And perhaps that's the greatest achievement of Family Guy's portrayal of Peter Griffin. He's not just a cartoon dad. He's a satire of the American everyman, a parody of sitcom tropes, and a mirror held up to our own messy humanity. Through Peter, we laugh at the absurdity of life, at the ways people can be both cruel and kind, foolish and wise, selfish and selfless, all within the same breath. As we continue deeper into Chapter 5, his evolution begins to reflect not just his role within the Griffin family, but his place within the broader cultural landscape. For Peter, every mistake, every chaotic adventure, and every fleeting moment of clarity builds into a portrait of someone who isn't easily dismissed, even if he's impossible to fully understand. And that's the paradox of Peter Griffin. A man who, despite being one of the most ridiculous characters in animated television, somehow feels all too real. Peter's world, for all its eccentricities and wild unpredictability, never stays still for long. Just as one chaotic episode fades into memory, another rises from the horizon like an incoming storm cloud, always carrying with it a peculiar mixture of absurdity, humor, and often a strange kind of tenderness that only emerges once the laughter has settled. The previous chapter left Peter standing in the aftershocks of his reckless antics, both humbled and strangely uplifted by the way his family kept orbiting back to him, no matter how far his own missteps seemed to carry him away. It's within this pattern of folly followed by reconciliation, of chaos followed by reflection, that Peter's true essence reveals itself, not just as a man fumbling through life, but as a mirror for the human condition wrapped in satire and slapstick. The rhythm of Peter's life almost feels musical, loud crescendos of disastrous choices, punctuated by softer interludes where he stares, however briefly, at the wreckage and wonders what it all means. This constant alternation creates a strange harmony in his story, It's during these quieter interludes where one can trace threads of longing, of curiosity, of that hidden desire to be more than just a caricature of dysfunction. And so, as the new arc of his journey unfolds, we see him slipping once again into situations that promise laughter on the surface, but that, upon closer inspection, carry echoes of deeper truths. The chapter begins with Peter in the most mundane of settings, the Griffin living room. The television hums softly in the background, Lois tidies up absent-mindedly, and Stewie sits cross-legged on the floor building some elaborate structure out of blocks, muttering to himself about blueprints and inferior design principles. Chris, meanwhile, scrolls aimlessly on his phone while Meg hovers in the kitchen doorway, waiting for a moment of acknowledgement that never comes. At first glance, it's an ordinary scene, but this ordinariness is the canvas on which Peter's next misadventure will be painted. It starts, as it often does, with a single, careless remark. Peter, reaching for the remote, complains loudly about how boring life has become. I mean, come on, Lois. We live in Quahog. The most exciting thing that ever happens here is when the guy at the clam forgets to charge me for fries. His voice carries that mixture of dissatisfaction and childish restlessness, the tone that so often precedes disaster. Lois sighs, brushing her hair back from her face, already bracing herself for whatever half-baked scheme is about to tumble out of his mouth. That's the rhythm of their marriage, after all, Peter's boundless appetite for distraction, and Lois's resigned but steadying presence. From that small spark, the idea grows. Peter insists he needs to do something big, something that will put him on the map, something that people will remember. I don't want to just be Peter Griffin, the guy who drinks at the clam. I want to be Peter Griffin, the guy who changed the world. His declaration echoes through the living room, grandiose yet oddly sincere. Lois, of course, shakes her head, muttering under her breath about how the last time Peter tried to change the world and the fire department had to hose down the whole block. But Peter is already swept up in the current of his own imagination, blind to consequence. And here lies the central thread of this segment, Peter's insatiable craving for significance. It isn't enough for him to exist quietly within the steady rhythm of family life. His ego and curiosity constantly drive him to leap into roles far larger than he can handle, whether it's starting a band, running for political office, or launching an ill-advised business venture. Peter thrives on the idea of being somebody important, even if only for a fleeting moment. This pattern, while hilarious in execution, reflects something universal: the restless human need to matter, to leave behind a mark, however small or ridiculous. As the episode within his life continues to unfold, Peter's new obsession quickly takes shape. Inspired by a late-night infomercial, he decides he's going to reinvent himself as a motivational speaker. The irony, of course, is that Peter Griffin, the very embodiment of bad decisions, irresponsibility, and chaotic living, believes he is equipped to guide others toward success and happiness. It's absurdity at its finest, the kind of satirical juxtaposition that makes Family Guy both ridiculous and sharp. Yet beneath the laughter lies a question worth pondering. How often do people in real life take on roles of authority without truly having the wisdom or discipline to justify it? Peter throws himself into his new role with wild enthusiasm. He prints flyers with slogans like, "Get Griffinized and unlock your inner quahog." He books a room at the local community center and, with the help of Quagmire and Cleveland, sets up a makeshift stage complete with a microphone, some second-hand spotlights, and a backdrop painted to look like a sunrise. The entire town is skeptical, of course, but curiosity draws a surprising crowd. Quahog residents have learned to expect the bizarre from Peter, and in a strange way, his antics provide entertainment for the community as much as they embarrass his family. The scene is rich with comedy, the crowd murmuring, Lois sitting in the back row with her arms folded, Stewie rolling his eyes at the amateur theatrics, Brian smirking knowingly as he scribbles sarcastic notes in a small journal. And then Peter bursts onto the stage, dressed in an ill-fitting suit that looks borrowed rather than owned, his tie crooked, his expression brimming with unearned confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declares, his voice booming with false gravitas, "you are about to witness the dawn of a new era, the Griffin era." At first, it's all ridiculous posturing. Peter paces back and forth, quoting half-remembered phrases from self-help books and sprinkling in bizarre anecdotes about drinking contests and chicken fights. The audience laughs, sometimes with him, but often at him, yet somehow his enthusiasm carries the performance. His words, while nonsensical, tap into something primal, the desire for change, for reinvention, for hope, even if that hope comes wrapped in nonsense. And in this bizarre spectacle, we see a reflection of something all too familiar, the way people are drawn to charisma over substance, to promises over practicality. As the night wears on, the comedy deepens. Peter accidentally knocks over the backdrop, trips over the microphone cord, and at one point mistakes an exit sign for a divine message, guiding him toward enlightenment. Yet amid the slapstick chaos, there's a moment where Peter, catching his breath, lets his bravado slip. He admits quietly and almost sincerely that sometimes he feels invisible, like just another face in the crowd. "I want to be somebody," he mutters almost to himself. "I don't want to just fade away." The audience, for a brief heartbeat, goes silent. It's a glimpse of the Peter beneath the bluster, the man who hides his insecurities behind humor and noise. And it's in these fleeting confessions that his story resonates most deeply, because who hasn't, at some point, felt the same? This tension, between comedy and sincerity, between absurdity and truth, drives the segment forward. By the end of the night, Peter's motivational seminar is both a disaster and a success. A disaster because everything falls apart in the most spectacularly Peter-like fashion. But a success because people leave laughing, smiling, and oddly inspired, not by his wisdom, but by his sheer audacity, his willingness to stand on that stage and make a fool of himself for the sake of being heard. And isn't that, in its own strange way, a kind of achievement? The story of Peter's seminar sets the stage for what comes next. The ripple effects of his actions, the way his family reacts to his newfound ambition, and the larger questions about how much of Peter's foolishness is really foolishness at all. For beneath the chaos lies a simple, aching truth, the desire to matter, to be remembered, to claim even a small piece of significance in a world that so often feels indifferent. Stewie's reflections on the duality of Brian, the intellectual confidant who occasionally lapses into weakness, and the flawed companion whose imperfections sometimes mirror his own, had only just begun to unravel in his mind. He leaned back, clasping his little hands behind his head, the glow of a desk lamp bouncing off the walls of his nursery, and let the narrative of their bond stretch further across the years. It wasn't a neat, tidy friendship. It wasn't a sterile transaction of intellect for company. It was messy, bruised by reality, and strangely beautiful. This realization gave the story of Stewie and Brian an almost literary weight, as though they were characters bound together in a grand novel of conflicting temperaments, philosophical debates, drunken misadventures, and occasional moments of quiet vulnerability. To see them only as cartoonish archetypes, the sarcastic dog and the hyper-intelligent baby, was to miss the deeper undercurrents. And so, as Stewie's mind wandered, he revisited the times when Brian was not the voice of reason, not the stabilizer, but the one who tumbled headfirst into folly, forcing Stewie to step into the role of caretaker. One of the most vivid memories was Brian's constant battle with alcohol. It wasn't simply a comedic crutch or a throwaway gag. It was one of those painfully human flaws wrapped in the guise of a talking dog. There were nights when Brian would spiral, reaching for the bottle with a shaky paw, his carefully constructed facade of wit and self-awareness collapsing under the weight of insecurity. And while Stewie would never admit it openly, he often felt a twinge of pity during these moments. For all of Brian's intellectual pretension, for all his grandstanding about literature, politics, and philosophy, he was still deeply lost, still reaching for something to fill the void. Stewie recalled how their roles seemed to reverse in those moments. The infant, outwardly helpless and contained within the image of childhood, became the grounding figure, while the adult, like dog, surrendered to weakness. It was a fascinating inversion of expectations, one that shaped the balance of their relationship. In truth, it kept their connection from ever stagnating. Neither Stewie nor Brian could permanently hold the title of mentor or student. They oscillated between these roles depending on the tides of their lives. And in that back and forth, their bond became far more authentic than it would have been if one had remained perpetually in charge. Another layer of their dynamic unfolded in their philosophical debates. They argued constantly about politics, about morality, about love, about the meaning of life itself. For Stewie, these discussions were more than idle banter. They were sparring matches, intellectual duels that sharpened his own mind. And yet Brian, for all his bravado, often failed to meet Stewie on his level. He contradicted himself, he overextended his arguments, and he revealed cracks in his worldview that Stewie could exploit. But instead of dismissing Brian entirely, Stewie found value in the imperfections of his arguments. They became teaching tools, opportunities to refine his own logic and test the resilience of his ideas. What Stewie respected most was not that Brian was always correct, because he rarely was, but that he was willing to stand his ground, to challenge Stewie even when outmatched. There was bravery in that, a sort of intellectual loyalty that Stewie could not easily find elsewhere. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the willingness to engage in the duel, to step into the arena of ideas and spar with honesty, no matter the outcome. That was why, deep down, Stewie continued to seek Brian's company. But their companionship was not solely defined by intellect. The adventures they shared, the reckless escapades, the road trips across America, the accidental time travel mishaps, revealed another dimension of their bond. There was something sacred about experiencing chaos together, about enduring the absurdity of life as a duo. They might emerge battered, humiliated, or stranded in some unfamiliar place, but they always emerged together. And it was in those moments when survival or sheer determination bound them that their loyalty was most visible. One such memory lingered vividly in Stewie's thoughts. The road trip episodes, where the humor of their dynamic often gave way to quiet confessions, surprising revelations, or moments of shared vulnerability. No, on the open road, away from the rest of the Griffin family and the familiar trappings of Quahog, they were stripped down to the raw essentials of their friendship. It was in those spaces that Brian admitted fears he would never confess at home. It was in those silences that Stewie revealed fragments of his own insecurities, cloaked though they were in biting sarcasm. These journeys symbolized something larger. They were escapes, not just from Quahog, but from the roles they played within the Griffin household. For a time, they were not the baby genius and the pretentious dog. They were simply travelers, bound by a shared need to see beyond the narrow scope of their lives. This freedom created an intimacy that could not be replicated elsewhere. And yet, for every profound moment, there were equal moments of bitterness, fights that pushed their friendship to its breaking point. Stewie remembered clearly how easily Brian could hurt him with carelessness, an offhand dismissal of his inventions, a belittling comment about his dreams, or a selfish act that prioritized Brian's desires over their partnership. These betrayals left scars, small but lasting, reminding Stewie that loyalty was not always consistent. But then, wasn't that the truth of all relationships? Flaws, wounds, forgiveness. They all formed the fabric of something real. At times, Stewie wondered whether Brian truly understood how much he relied on him. Not as a protector, not as an intellectual equal, but as a constant presence, a voice in the room, a companion at his side, someone who was always there to bear witness to his genius, his follies, his victories, and his humiliations. Without Brian, Stewie sometimes feared he would unravel, swallowed by isolation. That was perhaps the greatest irony. The baby who once plotted the world domination and dreamed of independence above all else had tethered himself emotionally to a flawed, neurotic dog. The thought both amused and unsettled him. What if Brian disappeared? What if he left for good or worse? What if he died? Stewie shivered at the memory of the one episode that forced him to confront this exact possibility. It had shaken him to his core, a rare moment where the veil of satire lifted and raw emotion poured out. Stewie's frantic desperation to bring Brian back wasn't just the grief of losing a friend. It was the terror of losing the anchor to his own identity. He thought back to the moment when Brian lay motionless, when the Griffin family stood in disbelief and how his world seemed to crack open. The tears he shed then were not calculated, not dramatized for manipulation. They were real, unfiltered, and horrifying in their intensity. The boy genius who scoffed at sentiment and mocked weakness had collapsed under the unbearable weight of loss. And though Brian was eventually restored through the strange machinations of time travel, the trauma of that event never truly left Stewie. It haunted him, whispering that their bond was far more fragile than he wanted to believe. It was this fragility, in fact, that made their companionship so meaningful. To love someone, or even to rely on them, was always a gamble. It meant accepting the inevitability of pain, the certainty of imperfection, the risk of betrayal or absence. And yet, Stewie embraced that risk, perhaps unconsciously, by continuing to let Brian into his world. For all his arrogance, for all his declarations of superiority, he allowed himself to be vulnerable in Brian's presence. That vulnerability was both his greatest weakness and his greatest strength. As Stewie dwelled on this realization, he found himself smiling faintly, though he quickly wiped it away as if ashamed of the softness it implied. He would never admit these thoughts aloud, never let Brian know the extent of his significance. But deep inside, Stewie knew that their bond, however flawed, was the truest connection he had ever experienced. And so as the lamp in his room flickered and cast long shadows against the walls, Stewie concluded that their friendship was not defined by perfection or constancy, but by its contradictions, its arguments and reconciliations, its wisdom and foolishness, its triumphs and betrayals. Like a living, breathing organism, it grew, faltered, and renewed itself again and again. The tension between Peter and Brian had reached a strange point of balance by the time the curtain began to fall on this chapter of their story. The journey had been long, filled with moments of hidden warmth and dark revelation, stitched together by secrets that no one else in Quahog would ever come to know. And as the shadows of their forbidden bond stretched into the quiet corners of their lives, one truth lingered. Their connection was both their greatest comfort and their deepest curse. Brian often found himself thinking about how far things had gone. He had once been just the dog of the Griffin family, a quirky intellectual with a whiskey glass in one hand and a sharp quip ready for any occasion. But somewhere along the lines blurred. His role as family pet twisted into something more intimate, something that defied definition. Peter's laughter, his clumsy affection, and his unexpected vulnerability had pulled Brian into a web where loyalty became entangled with desire. And yet, Brian never pulled away. The deeper they fell, the more inseparable they became. Peter, in his own way, had embraced this reality with a kind of careless acceptance. He never questioned the morality of it, never asked whether it was right or wrong. For Peter, everything was filtered through a lens of simple impulses and raw emotions. Brian was there for him in ways no one else could be. Lois with her judgment, Meg with her resentment, Chris with his distance, Stewie with his plotting. But Brian stayed. And for Peter, that loyalty became the foundation for something he could never fully explain. Their moments together weren't always wrapped in passion or secrecy. Sometimes it was the quiet gestures that meant the most. A beer shared on the back porch when the world was asleep. A drunken confession that Peter forgot by morning, but Brian never did. A glance during family dinners, subtle and fleeting, but enough to remind them both of the fire they carried within. These were the stitches that held their secret together, weaving a forbidden tapestry that only they could understand. And yet, with every bond comes the shadow of collapse. Brian knew it couldn't last forever. He had seen the cycles of Peter's life. The way his friend always stumbled from chaos to chaos, never lingering too long in one place, never truly holding on to anything. Brian feared that one day Peter would laugh it all off, dismiss their connection as some wild experiment, leaving Brian to drown in memories of nights that meant everything to him. But that day never came. Instead, Peter's strange devotion lingered, as solid as it was inexplicable. Lois, perhaps sensing the undercurrents, seemed caught in her own quiet battle. She didn't always see the details, but she felt the weight of something shifting between Peter and Brian. At times, her gaze lingered too long, searching for answers in silences she couldn't interpret. But Lois, ever pragmatic, chose to look away. Perhaps it was easier not to confront it, easier to let the bond remain hidden in the spaces where shadows thrived. Perhaps, deep down, she knew that pulling the thread might unravel more than just Peter's secrets. As the days turned into nights, and the nights into the quiet hum of another ordinary morning in Quahog, Peter and Brian's bond became less about the forbidden and more about the inevitable. It was no longer just about passion or secrecy. It was about survival. In a family as chaotic as the Griffins, they had found in each other a rare kind of sanctuary. Brian's words gave Peter comfort. Peter's warmth gave Brian purpose. Theirs was a connection that couldn't be explained away by reason or morality. It simply was. And so the story of their bond did not end with a grand revelation or a tragic collapse. It ended as it had lived, in quiet persistence, in the kind of hidden companionship that thrives in silence. For though they carried a weight too heavy to ever speak aloud, they carried it together, and in that, they found a strange kind of peace. As the curtain draws to a close on this episode, the lingering echoes of their connection remain. It is not a love story in the traditional sense, nor is it a tale of betrayal. It is something far more complex, a forbidden bond born from loneliness, sustained by secrecy, and cemented by unspoken understanding. A bond that, like so much in the world of Family Guy, lives in the spaces between laughter and darkness, between comfort and chaos. And while the world of Quahog may never know, while Lois may never uncover the full truth, while Stewie may only suspect, the story remains etched in the silence between Peter and Brian, a secret that lives not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments they share night after night. So, as you drift now into sleep, let their story linger at the edges of your dreams, not as a tale of right or wrong, but as a reminder of how complex and fragile connections can be. Sometimes, the bonds we forge defy reason. Sometimes they exist simply because they must. And in the end, perhaps that is enough. With the lights dimmed and Quahog once again slipping into quiet, the episode closes here. A story of laughter, of shadows, a forbidden closeness that rests just beneath the surface. And as the night continues, the echoes of Peter and Brian's secret remain, tucked safely away in the stillness of their world, waiting, enduring, eternal.